Bonds Review. It's great to have you here today.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, and it's a real honor actually for you to come onto this show because it's really, you've been a pioneer in on-chain governance. It's something I've been very loud about in terms of which direction we should go in. And it's fantastic having you here, and just welcome. And this will be a great discussion, I'm sure.
Well, thank you. I'm very touched.
Fantastic. Okay, so part of the format is really to learn about Tezos and to really go deep and ask a few hard questions if we can, and really explore that. So, can you give like a 5-minute explanation of Tezos and what sets it apart and what makes it unique? Why you created it? Why it should even exist? The elevator pitch, so to speak. That's how I like to start these things so far.
So Tezos is a blockchain. It's a blockchain system. So people use different words. They call this an L1. They call it or distributed ledger technology was popular at some point. But at the end of the day, what it is, it's decentralized and it's a ledger. That's fundamentally what you want. The thing that makes it, I would say, unique is its ability to evolve. It has a built-in decentralized governance model in it, and it means that it has been evolving over the years. The work on the chain started in 2014. The chain launched in 2018. But since 2018, it's gone through 14 upgrades. And what's very important is all of these upgrades have been vetted and validated by the validators and participants to the Tezos protocol. So it's a protocol that takes its own evolution very very seriously. And it's not just something that's abstract. This governance ability has kept Tezos decentralized, while at the same time kept it on the forefront of innovation. Tezos was a pioneer in proof of stake. So when it launched in 2018, it was the first major. I think it was the first proof of stake protocol with slashing, so with economic conditions. So it was proof of stake with teeth. So you didn't have to use all the energy of proof of work for functioning. And now it's becoming a pioneer in scaling.
No, for sure. And Tezos has always been a pioneer to me, because even from the early days when I was involved, it was I think it was Dash, Decreed, and then Tezos, really, in terms of the first people to really explore on-chain governance the way you did. And today I just see it as just necessary. I mean, it's all just decentralization theater in the end if you don't actually have decentralized governance, because decisions still, need to be made. What was like because I think that was really the first big innovation in Tezos. Would you agree with that? Like that was very much the central idea of what Tezos needed to bring initially, at least.
There were three pillar ideas, I would say. Governance was the most important one, I would say, because it begets everything else in some sense. If you if you can upgrade yourself, essentially you can pick up everything. And it sounds obvious because I would say now every blockchain has some form of governance. It's not always decentralized, but it is a form of governance. But at the time, in 2014, the idea was that if you had a new idea for a new feature, you would launch an entirely new chain, and that was it. And it would not evolve. And I was like, well, that's silly. We can't just innovate by launching a new chain every single time there's a new idea. And that sounds very obvious now, but it was somewhat novel at the time.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing. But the other thing was proof of stake. Proof of stake was quite French in 2014 when when it started. Now it's by far the dominant method of consensus, and a focus on smart contract security.
Yeah. That's interesting what you said about governance as well, because if it's not there, I actually think it's always there. Like someone is always making decisions, and governance is also the one thing you need in order to avoid how do I put this? In order to avoid getting a new blockchain every time, is as long as you have the governance in place, then the rest can really follow.
Yeah, that's you don't want to have a choice between stagnation or basically just duplication.
Stagnation or duplication, right?
But I think at some point down the line, I think governance will become over the years perhaps less important. But it's very important when you are in a position where you need to innovate, where a lot of new ideas are coming. So ideas around privacy, around scaling, around consensus. At some point, once you've picked down all these fruits, blockchains are going to get as good as they can get. If they're extremely fast and extremely cheap and extremely decentralized, and you have all of this, then the question is like, well, what is there to have governance over? And the last thing you have governance over essentially is issuance. Like at the end of the day, the only thing that's left to govern is saying like, do you want to fund some public goods which are not necessarily technological changes with issuance, and that like on-chain treasuries are as the last bits that you want to govern once you've essentially picked all of the technological
I mean,
progress that you.
treasuries will require constant decision making, right, to
Yes,
maintain a treasury.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's the last thing that's the last
yeah,
remaining bit of governance.
yeah.
What once basically the whole tech tree has been captured, that's
I'm
that's
I'm
it.
I'm I'm skeptical of that idea. Can you think of a technology in the digital age that's finished
Uh,
evolving?
it's not that it's finished evolving. It's just that it becomes less important. To give you an idea,
Right.
my background before this, I worked in high frequency trading for a while, and I saw the high frequency trading industry in the US. A lot of it was a reaction to a regulation NMS, which basically mandated some form of level playing field between exchanges, and that created a whole high frequency trading industry. And at first, if you look at this industry, it's a lot of shops with like three people and a bunch of computers making a lot of money. And why? Because they needed to innovate, and banks were not doing that. It was like all these tiny companies. And then they were getting more ideas and more ideas and more ideas. And then progressively, the level, the importance of innovation becomes less and less, and the importance of like just like scaling it and doing it very cheaply and very and in a very like formal process becomes more important. And now all of this is done by just a few firms. So you have this kind of like explosion around innovation, and then at some points when the innovation becomes less important, it settles. And so yeah, we I think that there's always innovation, in I don't know, in hammers, but hammers have gotten probably as good as they're gonna get today. It's not to say that we can make a better hammer. It's just that the importance of R&D in hammer production
Okay.
is not what it was in the
Hammer is
Paleolithic
a good
age.
example.
Yeah.
I'll accept that as as a good example. Absolutely. I'm sure some hammer company somewhere is like, well, but yeah, but I absolutely see your point there. Um, well, it's interesting that you say that because I have to be honest. I usually associate decentralized governance with, well, I think it depends on scale. So usually at a small scale, decentralized governance is very unwieldy, and it takes more time to have to go through these processes. And then at large scale, it seems like decentralized governance actually prevents deadlock, prevents stagnation. So it seems to have like a different effect at a different scale. um, the effect of decentralized governance. I mean, I think it's important to admit its shortcomings too. What do you
Yeah.
think of that?
I mean, the main the shortcomings you have for decentralized governance is that it's the usual. I would say it's the usual shortcomings of governance you have, and this, whether it's governance of states or governance of corporations, you always have these problems. How do you protect the minority against the majority? That's like a typical problem. How do you make sure that people are incentivized to be knowledgeable about the decision that they're making and make good decisions? How do you measure if you're making good decisions? So the problems of governance are known, and whether or not you have decentralized governance or any other form of governance, you're going to still import those problems with you.
No, so certainly, I think it's definitely not a one and all solution. So there's a certain idea I've been throwing around recently, and I'm really curious what you think about it because you have a lot of experience, with Tezos and its decentralized governance. And my theory is this: I absolutely think on-chain governance is critical, and we can get into the reasons why I think that a bit more. But um, I actually think that at a small scale, I don't think decentralized governance actually works in that it's not really quote unquote decentralized, defining decentralization as, the distribution of power, because there's still too few actors involved and they can all speak with each other, and, politics happens, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that my motivation in thinking about decentralized governance for Tezos came from objections of the Bitcoin community around improvements. And you know, I first started thinking about this. This is like I think it was 2011. I'm in London. I'm in the hackerspace, and I meet I think it was Amir Taki. Randomly, didn't know who he was. We start talking about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I love Amir Taki, by the way. He's a
He's
fascinating
great.
guy. Yeah, he's fantastic. Yeah.
And and I say, well, I like Bitcoin, but I don't really like the proof of work aspect, because it means essentially you have permanent inflation, or you lack your security budget. And it says, but Bitcoin is not a it's not an algorithm. It's a ledger fundamentally. And so long as you preserve the ledger, you can always change the underlying algorithm. It doesn't, and that made me very comfortable with Bitcoin, because I was like, well, fundamentally, what matters is kind of like shelling point, or focal point that people have around this ledger, and how you power it in some sense doesn't really matter. So I'm thinking through this, but I'm also thinking, okay, but how do we, in some sense, we agree that this is a ledger, but we also agree on the rules for changing it, and how do we agree to change the algorithm? Like, if there's to be a change, how does that work? And I
Mm.
started thinking about this for a few years, and then it's 2013, and there's a lot of innovation which are coming. So I'm reading a lot about proof of stake at the time. I'm reading about zero knowledge proof for privacy, which I think is a big issue in current blockchains. I'm reading also about smart contracts, and I'm very excited because I'm like, oh, finally, a lot of the issues that I see in Bitcoin Canon will be fixed. And then this is around the zero coin paper and the Dcash paper. I realize, just like in the Bitcoin community, there's basically this idea is like, oh no, we're not going to put that into Bitcoin. Like, well, wait a second, that's a problem. And at the end of the day, also, like, who decides what gets into Bitcoin? And the general feeling becomes, well, if we let anyone have a say in what gets into Bitcoin, then some people could just decide to do bad things, which I completely buy. And so I'm thinking of governance in terms of more about, in some sense, there's a lot of things which are good and which you all agree are good. So if your blockchain is faster as opposed to slower, that's a good thing. If your blockchain is safer as opposed to less safe, that's a good thing. They're not very controversial. So the role of your governance, you'll get a lot of bang for your buck if your governance just lets you prevent bad things. So as long as you have a governance system that will say, like, okay, someone is trying to take over the ledger, clearly we don't want that. Uh, then you get a lot of the benefits of the governance without a lot of the risks.
I think, yeah, that's. I think you're almost being too graceful there in the way you're describing the Bitcoin governance process. Because I mean, on the one hand, they say, "Oh well, it should be difficult to change," right? But then radical changes are still made, right? Because the practically the governance, like that's what we're talking. That's what you're saying before as well. Um, like even if there is no on-chain governance, there is still governance. Like politics still happens, and like someone still gets to decide. And I think it's the lack of on-chain governance that really, leads. In the case of Bitcoin, I would say, well, it's not the case. Like I think that's a very charitable argument, right? To say that, oh no, we won't allow any more changes because that's too risky, right? That's a very charitable position, but then you have things like RBF and SegWit and not increasing the block size and a bunch of other issues like this, which
Yeah.
I kind of feels really that throws a spanner in that interpretation of Bitcoin governance.
No, that's fair. But I also don't think that anyone is, I don't think anyone basically elected themselves as dictator of Bitcoin governance or anything like that. It's just that you have a form of governance whether you like it or not. And it's going to, if you try to not have an explicit one, there's going to be an implicit one that's going to be projected on
Exactly.
you. And
Yeah,
the
that's it
implicit,
exactly.
and Bitcoin, I think, got stuck into this weird hole, where it's like a lot of sensible stuff are basically going to be blocked. and that's about that being said, like, personally, I like segwit, I like RBF. I don't I think the limits on the block size are too strict, but fundamentally the problem is, like,
You like
simple
RBF? We'll have to talk about that later. But let's
I'm happy to
continue.
talk about that. But, like, I'm fundamentally thinking that um things that should be slam dunks, like, hey, have a primitive to verify snarks and
Yeah,
starks. You'll get yourself ZK rollups. You know what? There's basically almost zero trade-off for Bitcoin in doing that.
yeah, I
And
agree.
and,
I
and
agree.
still that there's kind of like this massive reluctance,
Yeah.
which is weird. Even in the face of, like, the extreme success of competing at once.
And that's a good example because it's even consistent with their own view on blockchain design, even. So it's like
Yeah.
it would be much better than the Lightning Network having ZK rollups on Bitcoin.
Absolutely. I think it'll end up happening, but I think it's going to end up even when it does happen, basically without a good data availability solution, it won't go
Mm,
very far. So,
yeah,
you
true.
know, if I would convince Bitcoin, I would not convince Bitcoiners because I have there's Tezos, but
I mean, SegWit was kind of like a data availability solution for Lightning Network,
which
right?
one?
If SegWit was kind of like
No,
a
it is. It
data
is a
availability
data.
solution for Lightning Network,
It
right?
is, but
That's
like full sharded data availability is what I would advocate, and
sure.
they're never doing that.
No, 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 that's true. Yeah, definitely nothing like what dank sharding will look like in
No.
Ethereum. And uh, uh, Tezos, I remember reading about data availability committees being opt-in.
Yeah, so we have two
That's
things.
yeah,
We did a demo of when I say we, I mean the different core teams working on Tezos, so that includes Nomadic Labs, Tree Tech, and a few others. There was a demo of showing 1 million transactions per second on Tezos using a layer 2 solution and using data availability committee. So data availability committees, basically you're relying on a group of parties to do your data availability off-chain for you.
yeah. So this is very much like the Ethereum style layer twos, then, in many ways, because it's
So it's similar, but a lot of layer twos in Ethereum, I don't know. Some of
mm,
them use data availability committees. Some of them use Ethereum as data availability itself.
right, right. But I'm
Arbitrum
curious.
has both, for example.
Like, I'm curious, why pursue this when you're doing enshrined rollups? Like, enshrined rollups just seem like
They
a
are
better
enshrined
solution.
rollups, but
Oh, they
you can
are.
have you can have an enshrined rollup use a data
Okay.
availability committee if you want. But
I suppose that makes
ultimately,
sense. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
it's a stopgap. Ultimately, we're like building a data availability layer,
Yeah.
which is very much like Deng sharding.
Yeah.
Very similar to Deng sharding.
That
So that
makes
one
sense.
is basically at the blockchain level. The data availability committees, they have a slightly different security profiles. Um, they let you do something where you have security so long as you have one honest member out of n. So you get into this position where a single dishonest member of your data availability committee can throttle transactions, can kill the throughput a lot,
Yeah.
but it would take n-1 to be evil to cause a safety
Yeah.
fault, which
Okay.
is which for a lot of application is not a bad trade-off. So I think it's interesting to have in the design space for some applications.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I mean,
But
it's just
ultimately,
having the options not bad, right?
yeah. Ultimately, I think you want something like what we call the DAL on Tezos and what they call dank sharding on Ethereum. But I'm glad they call it dank sharding because I think Dankrad is a fascinating researcher and he's definitely really been pushing the research
Yeah.
on that topic.
I have to admit, I jumped the gun there a little bit because I'm trying to follow a structure here, and I jumped the
Okay.
gun a little bit asking about data availability. And I realized the question that I had for you before,
Yeah.
I don't like we kind of went off on another direction. I don't feel like you quite answered it, which is that in my view, decentralized governance doesn't truly work in terms of a truly effective distribution of power until you're at a very massive scale with far more participants involved. And I would say that actually, I mean, this is a spectrum, right? But this would even include things like Tezos and
Mhm.
Ethereum and Bitcoin potentially. I'm not sure where that level exactly is in terms of what is sufficient scale to achieve decentralization, but I don't think most projects really have that, and I think it's something that's important to acknowledge. But I'm very curious about what your view on that is in particular, because this is something that's I've been
Yeah.
thinking about a lot.
So I would call that de facto versus de jure decentralization.
Yes,
So
correct.
the
Yeah,
de jure decentralization is no one is a privileged party. Everyone is basically starts out on an equal playing field, and therefore, there's nothing in your algorithm or your protocol that says, "Oh, that person is more
yeah,
important."
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Uh,
I call that technical decentralization, and Tezos is
uh,
completely technically
yeah,
decentralized as far as I'm
which is
concerned. I
important
don't need
because it's
convincing
often
there.
missing. And then the
Yeah,
second thing is like de facto, we say like, okay, so you have this, but in practice, you'll find that oh well, some people have a lot more influence, some people have a lot more importance, and so on and so forth. Um, I think de jure is overall, I think people overrate the importance of uh, the de facto decentralization and underrate de jure, which is not to say, and I'm talking at the margin here. I'm not saying that the de facto is not important. I'm saying people focus on it a lot, whereas whereas actually the jury matters. And it reminds me a lot of this debate around rights and negative rights versus positive rights. People will say, oh, what does it matter that you have all these negative rights, like the right, like freedom, property, all of that, if you're a wage slave and you can't afford this and you can't afford that. And in practice you realize that, well, yes, but in practice having those negative rights do tend to be get positive rights. And I think I agree with you, it's a matter of scale. But if you don't start having the de jure decentralization at at a small scale, it becomes very hard to bolt it on later at a larger scale, because you'll inherit those properties.
I had to think about that. To bolt the what I call technical decentralization on later. Yeah,
Yeah, you can't bolt that on later.
exactly.
Like
Yeah, no,
you can
yeah,
say, like, well, when we're big and when it matters, when we're big and we're able to have a lot of de facto decentralization, then we'll bolt that on. And
yeah.
I don't think that works.
Yeah, because by that point it's too late. Your system is in all likelihood already captured, and then you're asking the people in power to surrender their power,
Mm.
which in history is the exception and not the rule. So yeah, I agree with you there. Which is why I'm also skeptical of cryptocurrencies that are technically centralized and still say, oh, we'll decentralize at some point in the future. It's like, well, in most cases that never happens. In my experience, having
Mm.
been a researcher for the last 7 years in cryptocurrency, that hardly ever happens. So it's rare. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair answer. But I think it's important because at an early stage, I think we're still very dependent upon the leadership for that reason. I think because of the practical decentralization, right?
Mm.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that and like not use that as a shield. It's
Yeah.
obviously not as strong of a shield as claiming there's no governance and then
Mm.
being like a puppet master.
Of course, of course. And
Yeah.
I'll gladly acknowledge that I'm very influential, obviously, on the Tezos project and in Tezos community. Anyone would have to be blind and not to
Mm,
say that, and I acknowledge it. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't give me, it doesn't mean that I have unlimited powers, or it doesn't mean that I can do anything that I want, and that's very important. Like there's
yeah.
actual controls. Like I can't
Yeah.
go tomorrow and say, you know what, let's just like triple the supply of Tez. Can't do
Right.
that.
No, of course.
If I say, if I go and say, you know what, it's very important that we do data availability layers. It's so much more better than like data, committees. There, I have enough clout. I have enough ways to like really convince people and like and make that happen. So like definitely I have this type of influence,
Mhm.
but like the ability to like do like
Yeah.
nasty things to the protocol, no.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of having a good understanding of politics and governance is that, look, someone is going to have influence, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. At an early stage, these projects are still so dependent upon good leadership. So, whether that's a good or a bad thing, whether you have as much influence very much depends on where you're steering Tezos, in that
Mm.
process. So yeah. But I think it's important to acknowledge these things, and I do feel you have acknowledged that. Since we're still talking about governance, and yeah, I'm such a fan of Tezos, and for many years now because I've been an advocate. I really think like it's not a good layer one if it doesn't have formalized on-chain governance and a
Mhm.
treasury. Like one of the things that I've seen repeating in terms of like really identifying systemic flaws in governance is that I feel like there's instances where funding occurs on for core developers that might give them perverse incentives.
Mhm.
So L2, I think a lot of some of the L2 things, both in Ethereum and BTC, are actually an example of that, where um, basically they have a perverse incentive not to scale the L1 because there's this outside source of funding that can then bias and corrupt do good decision making essentially. And this
Yeah.
is where having a treasury I think is very important because what I've been saying is it creates a layer one biased source of funding, and that can be a really powerful force against corruption, against potential capture, and also
Mm.
sustaining development and doing all sorts of really cool things that you could actually do with that,
Yeah.
which then allows you also to be more competitive on top of all those other things. So yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of what Tezos has done in terms of governance, and treasuries in that regard
Well,
as well.
in Treasury side, I would say Tezos has been quite weak in this respect. There hasn't really been on-chain treasuries on Tezos. We've
It's
had.
it's set up, but it's never been used, if I understand correctly, right?
So I'll tell you what's in place. So what was happened before is been invoices for the protocol. So someone does a core protocol upgrade, and they say like, here's a new protocol upgrade. And by the way, if you vote for this, some tokens will be created, and the author
Yeah.
will be rewarded. But what happened initially is, the Zeus Foundation in Switzerland raised a bunch of money, and then they kept it in Bitcoin. Bitcoin appreciated a lot, and they ended up with even more money. And so at that point, the Tezos Foundation is mandated essentially by law to spend its money to promote the Tezos ecosystem. It has a purpose, which is the promotion and the growth of Tezos ecosystem and related technologies. So it's funded a lot of the core development. It would be silly to basically just have the foundation do this and say, oh, on top of this, we want to be paid by getting more token and inflating. People feel like, well, all this, we contributed all this money to the foundation. Why should we like get
I'm really
diluted?
I'm very glad you
So
brought this up. I am because I was
uh,
actually going to bring this up. It was actually one of my big
yeah,
critiques of Tezos, and you beat me to it. I'm actually thrilled.
yeah.
That's well done.
Well, the
So
point is the foundation has all
continue,
this money,
continue.
so it's gotta is it's gotta spend it. Now the difficulty is that you know if we want to be sustainable over very long term, over time, the funding has to come from the chain itself, right? So you need to be in a position where the funding for your ecosystem, for your core development, all of that is coming fundamentally from inflation, and that budget can be as high or as low as you want. Or sorry, it can't be as high as you want. At some point, you hyperinflate and you go to zero, so that doesn't work. But let's say realistically, you could like probably like inflate by a couple percent a year, and that gives you a budget for activities. Like today, the budget that the Tezos Foundation spends on the protocol is much higher than like a couple percentage of the market cap. Unfortunately, um, I proposed treasuries on-chain treasuries, but one thing that I wanted from the beginning, I said, look, here's a design for it. Go and build it, because I've always been a bit worried if people say, "Oh, we want an on-chain treasury because we want to make this decision and so on and so forth." And I was like, okay, so take a bit of initiative, like show what you're going to be doing. And unfortunately, we didn't really see anyone build a treasury. So very recently, we launched a small experiment. It's a small DAO. It's a multi-sig. Uh, but the point is to try to experiment with first like having community input on projects, having a vote, and then progressively funding it more, progressively like getting people more involved in it, having a mechanism for the bakers to basically change the signers, because you don't want your entire decentralized ecosystem to vote on every single proposal. That just doesn't scale. Like fundamentally, you do need to have some form of delegation of decision that happens, and that can be delegated to a smaller DAO. It can be delegated to an entity. But if you're trying to do, I don't know, if someone comes and say like, "Oh wow, I would love to have a $10,000 grant for, I don't know, for running like a series of meetups in this town because I think it would be great for Tezos." You can't just buzzer the entire network with like with a vote for that. So you need some form of delegation. And at this point, the form that we have is with the Tezos Foundation. I'd like to see more on-chain experiments. But given the amount of funding of the Tezos Foundation, historically, it wasn't a priority. But it's something that's been, I would say, growing more recently.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you brought that up actually, and there's multiple points actually to touch on there. So yeah, so one of my criticisms of Tezos was that proposals create new inflation. And I feel like the outcome of that is, well, two options. Either no one ever uses the proposal system, and then that's moot, right? Or you have, new inflation being created in a kind of an unpredictable manner, which I actually think is also a negative in terms of your, ideas around sound money and token economics and so forth. So I feel like that to me seems to be the wrong design choice in my view. And I think what other chains have done in terms of treasuries is they really just take part of the block reward, percentage of the block reward, fees and inflation,
Yeah.
and then it doesn't change issuance.
Yeah, so basically what you could do, what you're saying is like instead of just deciding what the issuance is going to be at the time where the protocol is injected, then what you do instead is you just accumulate it over time so that you spend it and it's more predictable. I mean, I think you can do both. Like the system lets you do both. I'm less concerned about it because fundamentally the parameters of governance in Tezos are very conservative. It takes an 80% supermajority.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an 80% supermajority of the bakers who represent the token holders who vote for a proposal that contains a significant amount of inflation, it's very hard to imagine scenarios where they would be happy to vote for that, and somehow it would be bad for the underlying economy. It's
Yeah.
like, if it were bad, why would they do it?
Well, that's why they're not doing it, right?
Well, we are no. The main reason I would say is like people have not. I don't. People have not come in with proposals to just go and say like, okay, I've spent all this money trying to improve Tezos, and here's the reward I want. But for this mechanism to work, I think Tezos would have to be much bigger.
I agree.
Uh,
I agree, actually, and this is what I was saying before about decentralized governance requiring more scale,
yeah,
and handling this kind of treasury, I think, requires that scale to really be effective. Unless you accept a very large amount of inefficiency and waste, right?
yeah.
Um,
Because it's
yeah,
a lot more profitable, and it's a mechanism that works well if you're the dominant blockchain,
yeah,
essentially,
yeah.
and you don't want people to try to compete. If you're okay, Ethereum is Ethereum. Let's say you want to create a competing L1.
Mhm.
You're going to make more money launching a competing L1 than improving Ethereum, right? That's still very true today. But if you had the possibility
Pretty
of
tough
saying,
market in 2023. To be fair, it's not
yeah, so
easy to
you launch
break
an
in.
L, so you launch some kind of L2, but really, you're not really adding much
Right.
much value. And if instead you let people say like, hey, you know what? If you can substantially improve the working of this very large ledger and cryptocurrency, it'll inflate by 0.5%. That's a huge amount of money, and all of a sudden it becomes much more profitable than trying to launch a token. So that's a mechanism that's important to have, but I would say it becomes important and relevant if you are in a somewhat dominant position already.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, and I understand, and having that in there at least sets up the the social contract, so to speak, of the
Yeah.
promise of that possibility. But yeah, but I really do think like just taking a fixed percentage of the block reward doesn't come with the downside of
Mm.
having to increase inflation in such a way, because it just
Yeah.
creates such a disincentive for it to ever to be used, right?
Yeah, and there's other things you can do. By the way, you don't have to. So you don't have to just take the risk of like funding something and then maybe you don't get inflation. So like a natural way to do this is like you make a proposal. You create a token, uh, empty token, and you say, look, I'm going to create this token and I'm going to make this proposal. And if this proposal is accepted, you'll convert this token into the native token through inflation. And then basically you have something you can sell for funding, for example, to build it. So there's a lot of mechanism for financing
Yeah.
those upgrades. But again, like the market for it exists if you are in a dominant position, which of course Tezos is not today.
Yeah, no, that's fair. No, and I'll be excited for let's say Tezos becoming larger and then actually, working out. But I'll definitely be voting for reworking that system and make it so it doesn't, create new inflation. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Why are you against using, say, the block reward for a fixed amount? Because then you can just take, say, 10%. I mean,
But
it's
it's the
not
same
gonna.
thing. The block reward is inflation.
Yeah, but that's a fixed amount, right? So it's predictable. You're not actually
Yeah.
creating more inflation because of the proposal.
I'm not against it. I don't think that predictability, like mathematical predictability, is that important. I think it's important. I think
Hmm.
what's more important is making sure that you don't have bad decisions. But like knowing
Right.
exactly is it's kind of
Right.
like, okay, so you'll see Bitcoiners saying like, ha, look at the supply of ether. It was deflating and now it's inflating. See, it's completely unpredictable. Okay, maybe you don't know what it is, but it still has a lot lower issuance than
No,
than
no, but
Bitcoin.
but but
So
that's the thing.
yeah,
I like Ethereum's model. I actually think Ethereum has the perfect economic model for a cryptocurrency, and we could maybe talk about that next. the combination, right, of having tail inflation,
Yeah,
right, with a fee burning mechanism, in my view, is actually ideal.
yeah,
But I feel there is a greater predictability to Ethereum's model compared to a system where proposals can create new inflation. Like, do you see the point? Because I mean, in Ethereum, I know it's an algorithmic supply and it depends upon economic conditions, but
yeah.
economic conditions are much easier to predict, in my view,
Yeah.
compared to, say, what proposal will be passed in such a
Mm,
political slash governance system, right?
it could be. I think ultimately it's like it's a product question, and it depends on like what consumers want. And if if there's a very very strong demand for predictability, then it can be done via the block reward, so that you can basically set a cap. You could set an inflation cap on the whole thing, and you can even enforce it by governance. So like one thing I propose is constitutionalism. You could even make it so that the inflation cap cannot be overridden even by vote. That's something that can be done in Tezos. You can actually restrict the vote to not touch inflation caps.
Like supply caps, or like of the
No inflation cap. So you could do
oh, the number of
you get a
inflation.
supply
I
cap,
see.
but you could
Yeah.
also you could have a governance proposal that says no matter what in the future, it will
Mm.
not be technically possible
Mm.
to have something that inflates by more than
Okay.
2% a year.
That
You
that
can, you can
that
even you can even do that.
Yeah, okay, that will relay my fears a bit of wanting a predictable supply. I think that might be an okay solution. I suspect the incentives just won't line up for it. Like, people won't use it because it's uh, it goes. I suppose we're tweaking and weighting the system a little bit differently, where you want only people to use it if they really really need to, and
Yeah.
it's like almost a disaster, right? Like, it's almost a really strong need for something, and then it would happen.
Yeah.
But
But
besides that, it would never happen.
but in
Is
some
that
sense, I would like to see that. I would if
Yeah,
somehow someone came out of the woodwork tomorrow and said
yeah.
here's a proposal, and and then everyone says like, oh my god, it's so good, it's going to change everything, and then like, well, yes,
Mm.
but I want to inflate by 10%, and everyone says like, if you we could inflate by 10%, but actually like it'll make the whole system twice as valuable, then
Okay.
that'd be fantastic. If that
Yeah,
happens, I think that's great.
yeah.
uh
No, fair
even
enough.
even if it's a large amount of inflation, it's
Yeah,
it's it's more about like what deal are you getting as a
yeah.
as a participant.
And it's in there, right? It's in the code that
Yeah,
this is possible. So
yeah, yeah,
that really, I was thinking about client diversity in connection to that. I
yeah.
suppose if people really started to dislike what the core team is doing, you could actually use this system to fund a competing client.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So
that's cool.
there's a notion. We have two notions of client for Tezos.
Okay.
One is we call the shell, and the shell basically it runs your peer-to-peer connection. It talks to other nodes. Uh, it maintains your state on your disk. And the other one is a protocol, and the protocol runs inside of the shell. And when we vote, what's what we vote to replace? We replace the protocol that's being run by the shell. And so in general, in most blockchains, these things are one and the same. So when they talk about client diversity, they talk about both an alternative implementation of the protocol and an alternative implementation of the shell. So for a
Okay.
while, we had in Tezos we don't have an alternative protocol in Tezos because fundamentally the hash of the protocol is part of every block. The blocks commit to the hash of the protocol because that's what we vote about. Like when we vote, we don't vote about some
Mhm.
abstract formal definition of the protocol. We vote on a concrete piece of code. So you could have an alternative implementation, but in some
So it's
sense
so it's a hash of the
of the source code.
code. Wow. Okay, I
Yeah.
didn't know that. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, you vote on a hash of the source code. It's not like, oh, let's do this. It's like it's very, very precise.
Mm.
But we had an alternative implementation of the shell in Rust.
But I
Uh,
suppose I'm sorry, I'm stuck. But I mean, alternative clients could still run and just vote on the same hash. Right? There's no.
yes, well, it
Yeah.
depends what you call alternative clients, alternative shells. Yes, and
Yeah,
also like
alternative shells on the same
yeah,
protocol. I mean, in the same sense that there's multiple
yeah,
clients
of course,
on
and
Bitcoin running the same quote unquote protocol. Like, it's sufficiently the same so you don't create a fork, right?
yeah, 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 exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, or a liveness fault, which is one of the things that's nice with finality is like your forks becomes liveness issue, and I'd much rather have a liveness issue than a fork.
Fair. Yeah,
This
that's
is this
that's
is
fair.
one insight that I got from It was Jake One presenting in 2016 in Palo Alto. And at the time, the received wisdom from everyone was like, oh, finality is terrible because your chain can stop. Like it's so much more important to have liveness. And he was like, well, wait a second. So let's say that New Zealand gets disconnected from the internet. Would you rather have two chains that progress and then some, or would you rather just stop because the connection is going to restore? Like you
Mm.
stop. Like it's crazy to favor liveness over safety. So
Hmm.
very very much in a camp. But yeah, so we had for a while a shell in Rust. It didn't get much pickup, unfortunately. Like very few bakers were using it, and because the shell for Tezos was under active development, it was always a little behind. So I think it's something that's easier to do once you have more stability in your shell. And I would say initially for Tezos, I think stability was a big goal. There was this idea, I would say, that I had initially for Tezos, that Tezos would be a bit of a fast follower. Essentially, there's innovation, we replicate the innovation, and it's basically a safe place where innovation is happening with a bit of delay. But again, that's better if you're in a dominant position. In the position that Tezos is in, it's you actually want to be a front runner. You actually want to have more variance, more innovation, and be a bit faster. But there's
No, I
also good
understand.
arguments against
I
client
understand that.
diversity. I would say so. There's a story I heard. I don't know if it's true. Is that the reason there's client diversity in Ethereum is because fundamentally Gavin Wood and Vitalik couldn't agree on a language
Oh,
for implementation.
I always assumed they just learnt the lesson from BTC, that they observed what was happening there with the block size debates. That
No,
was
because
my
that's what
assumption.
no, because the block cloud debate came much after.
Well, I mean, the debates were, I mean, like alternative clients had been started and those discussions were happening around 2015, right?
Yeah, but that's Ethereum is earlier. Ethereum's choice to have multiple client implementation are earlier than that.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
I mean, 2013, I think, because I think when did we have XT and all that? I'm not sure about the dates. Let me look it up real quickly, because I
a big
think that's what really kicked off the controversy, wasn't it?
yeah,
Just for the audience, XT was one of the alternative client implementation.
that was that was Gavin Edwardson's, right?
Yeah, and Mike Hearn.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, still heroes to me, even though they kind of lost. Yeah. Oh, you know what? I can't find this on the. I can't find the reference to this quickly, unfortunately. Okay, never mind. I have a little tablet here that I can look things up and take notes with. But to go back, you're saying so client diversity, because I feel like yeah, at an early stage, it really slows down development. It makes things 3 times more difficult and anything. So I understand that, but I think at a
Yeah.
later stage, I would see client diversity as being absolutely critical, because otherwise it's just you can vote, but it's a one party system, right? Like,
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, if the stakes become high enough and you're open source, people can fork, people can re-implement. So I would say the main benefit I see in client diversity is it's it's the approach that's used in this. So let me backtrack a bit. There's an
sure.
approach in software development, a traditional approach called the waterfall, where you basically like first get all the specification in your system, then you have specification and implementation, then you move to an implementation. And most software today is not really designed with a waterfall model. It's designed in a more agile fashion, where you basically code it a little bit, you try something, you realize that's not exactly what you wanted, and then you have these uh, uh, these updates, and you typically go faster in an agile model than a waterfall model. But there's a decent argument that certain things are better designed like a waterfall model. So like a rocket, for example, or potentially a blockchain, because the security is so important and you want to make sure that everything is very tight, that you understand what you're doing. And and again, I'm trying to make the case for multiple clients. So what the Ethereum Foundation has done essentially is saying, look, we're not going to implement any clients. What we'll do is we're going to write some spec. They're not going to be perfect, but we'll send them to different teams doing different implementation. And if those implementation happen to agree, then at least it tells us that our spec is sufficiently clear. And if they don't agree, then we have to clarify the spec. So it's kind of like a way to ensure that you have a decent spec, but it's also made them go super super slow.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, that's the trade-off, right? Like way slows down development. But it seems to me if you just have one development team, I find it hard. Like it's like in the case of Tezos, for example, if there is governance, I mean, it's only going to be implemented if some developer somewhere builds it, right?
Yeah,
So it's like to have true kind of diversity of choice and true competition. It would
yeah,
seem to me that you need client diversity for that reason, even though it's a big sacrifice to make, which why it makes sense to implement that later or let it organically kind of become right, and
yeah.
maybe support it in some ways if you can later. Yeah.
But I think it matters what the stakes are. And fundamentally today's the stakes for Tezos is like more visibility, more usage, more adoption, and the type of stakes where I would say it becomes very political, and this becomes major debate is at a larger stake. But you want to have the mechanisms in place, and that's what's quite important, and that's why things like open source licenses are so important, so that people can come in and fork. And sometimes it's not so much it's not so much the de facto doing, but more the de jure possibility of doing that matters more.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that because it's a very high. I mean, to actually have a client development team, that's people that are acquainted with the code that they need to build up trust over time. Just saying, oh, they can just create it in an instant when the main development team does something the community doesn't agree with. That seems I don't know, it seems a bit hopeful to me.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I would say it matters of like what is the stake, and I think if the stake is large enough, essentially, so there's a cost. Essentially, if you don't have this like in place, there's a cost for this to be able
Right.
to
Right.
happen. And the question is like, are the stakes large enough for people to pay that cost? And if the
Yeah.
stakes are not large enough, does it matter?
No, you're right. And in that sense, I understand. I'm really, really talking about a kind of a perspective from an ideal like endpoint,
No,
right?
of course, I
Where
agree.
you want to be and understand that, at an early stage that might not make sense, right? But it is definitely something I look at, like a measurement. If I see that there's multiple
Mm,
clients, I would consider that to be, you know, more decentralized and a more mature and more resilient ecosystem as well. Because that's another advantage of multiple clients, right? If you have
yeah,
a potential, I don't know, inflation bug or some sort of other bugs, then
yeah,
potentially, you'd still have clients that might not be vulnerable to that particular
yeah,
exploit or whatever it might be. And we've seen that in
absolutely,
Ethereum. We've seen that happen. Yeah.
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 But it happened at a time where they didn't have finality. So there's actually one of the person who argues, I think, convincingly about against client diversity is Peter Todd. So Peter
Hmm.
says, look, the problem is like if you have a disagreement, it's kind of worse if you have a fork because you're gonna have a bunch of transactions and like one of that branch is going to have to be rolled back, and that's really bad. And it's better to just have like one behavior. Unless if the behavior is very bad anyway, the chain will fork. But if it's a behavior, if it's a bug which doesn't affect the security but affects like how one transaction is treated, maybe the fee paid is like different by one sat. It's not a very big bug, but if somehow that fits your chain, that's worse. Um,
Right,
but
right, but I don't think that's the outcome though. Like it doesn't. If you think about it, like what happened with Ethereum when we had some critical bugs occur on some clients, it seemed to have resolved. Like people saw, a split happen, a fork happen. I mean, to be fair, I mean that happens all the time in Bitcoin as well, right? You have orphan blocks, and someone might build on a block and it gets orphaned. It's like these from a user's perspective, they don't really notice
yeah,
those type of disruptions, right? And then we resolve and we go onto the right fork. I just
mm,
it seems to me like that would still be you know a a better trade off, so to speak.
yeah, but I think in those fork that happened, like one branch was kind of borked, so it was like, well,
Right,
clearly we're not going onto that branch.
right, right,
But
right.
where I was going with this is like
Yeah.
if you have something that provides finality, then it's much better because if you have a disagreement between the clients, the chain stops. And by the way, so people give Solana a lot of slack for saying like, oh, it has office hours, it gets, it shuts down. I don't do that because fundamentally, I would say like one of the big wins that has been like found in the past few years is like sometime as a default, just like stopping. is a good thing. And so if you have a bug in your chain and you're like the behavior is like it stops, it's like, okay, you know what? Let's find out what the bug is, because a bug, it's not good to stop, but it's much worse to have a bug.
Right, but I mean, in the case of Solana, I have actually warmed up a bit towards Solana recently, because I have been a very big critic of it. But I mean, I still find it a bit ridiculous that a blockchain stops. I mean, that should never happen, really, to me. I mean, I believe, like, that's never happened to Ethereum, right? That's
No, they've
maybe it
had.
happened once to Bitcoin. Yeah, no, not really, not really, because the mempool was still there with the inflation bug I was thinking
Well,
of.
it stops for 10 minutes every 10 minutes. So
Well, it's
like,
another issue.
what is uptime in this thing that has like
Well,
that has
if
blocks?
if a user logs on and you get a message that it doesn't work, I would say that
Yeah.
counts, right? So I tend to take a user centric perspective, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Tezos has also never stopped, right? Blockchain has a flawless record, or
No, it's not flawless. I mean,
oh, okay.
there's been like pauses. They've always resolved themselves. I don't. There hasn't been like.
But when you say a pause, like what are we talking about here? Like
I think the longest one that happened in its history was like 5 years of history has been like maybe 2 hours or something like that.
2 hours, but that's no blocks are being created. Is the mempool still available?
The mempool is there. Yeah, it's just like
Okay.
the no blocks coming
All
through.
right. Well, that's a
Uh,
glitch. In
yeah,
Bitcoin, that would just be an anomaly, right?
yeah, that happens.
That
2 hours.
happens all the time. No, it happens
Yeah.
all the time. That takes 2 hours to create a block, like variance.
Some
Yeah.
there was also like an upgrade where the whole state tree was being rewritten.
Okay.
And so kind of like in this upgrade, we knew this would happen because like some clients would just like
Yeah.
take some time to do it.
Yeah.
And it was either like implement a very complicated thing that would do it lazily and so the chain wouldn't stop at all, or just say like, it's a one-off, and there'll be half an hour where the blocks are going to be janky, and then they'll be fine. Like in terms of trade-off and pragmatism, that was
Mhm.
much better than trying to uh, like uptime matters, but it is super important. It's not
Right.
the most important thing.
No, sure. I mean, like, it's not the end of the world that in the case of Tezos, okay, that I suppose that counts as an outage. But in the case of Solana, I think we're counting 12 plus times
They do
within
it
a
a lot.
relatively
Yeah.
short period of time. That's not a good look. Like, no matter
Yeah.
what way you cut it, that's just bad.
Yeah. I think it's okay for this to happen occasionally.
Yeah.
It does seem to happen to them a lot, though.
It's been fixed though. As far as I understand, the problems that caused all of this has been fixed, and actually, a lot of it was actually due to not having proper fee markets in place, which really allowed for the system to be overwhelmed and spammed and etc.
Yeah.
So, and I remember because I actually criticized Solana for not having fee markets, and I remember the Solana people were like, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I felt very validated when Solana actually did implement fee markets, and it's been relatively stable ever since then. So
I think fee markets are going to go
yeah.
away, though. I mean, sorry,
Hmm?
they won't go away, but they will become a lot less relevant in the future.
What will be less relevant? Sorry.
Fee markets.
I mean, yes, in the sense that if your chain is not congested, the fee market is not as relevant, right?
Yeah, you need to have a mechanism to protect yourself in case you reach you reach
Exactly. No,
congestion,
I
because
agree. I agree. Yeah,
but
and that is the perfect segue to talk about something very exciting here,
yeah,
because I'm a huge fan of what Tezos is doing in terms of scaling. I tend to be I'm very big on sharding as
yeah,
a scaling solution, but I very much see enshrined rollups as being, and just for the audience, Tezos has enshrined rollups today. I'm a big fan of enshrined rollups, and I strongly dislike what Ethereum is doing in terms of its L2 scaling roadmap and using these unenshrined rollups.
yeah.
I've been very outspoken about this. I think it's a tragedy that it pivoted in that direction, and I think Tezos has really been the perfect example of what Ethereum should be doing, which is enshrined rollups. And I'll let you expand on that some more before I rave
Absolutely.
on about how awesome enshrined rollups
I,
are
mean,
for the next few minutes.
I can talk about that. I can talk about sharding as well.
Yeah,
But the idea of a so first of all, what is a rollup? And the way I like to explain this is the value in a traditional L1 like Bitcoin, like original version of Tezos or like Ethereum. your validators do mostly three things. One is that they publish the data to everyone. They make sure that, and it's called data availability, but Dankrat from Ethereum explained that it should be called data publication, and I think he's very right. It's like we prove that the data has been made available to everyone. They order the transaction. They say which happened first, and it sounds like not very important, but that's actually how you solve the double spending problem. So ordering is very important. And then they maintain the state of the ledger and execute the transactions. So the idea of a rollup is, what if we posted a transaction inside of the chain, but we didn't execute them? We don't ask the validators to execute them. And if you do that, the validators are, they don't have to consume as much resources. So potentially you can put more transaction because the validators are not busy to execute them. But someone needs to execute them. And so on a rollup, you say, well, some party, anyone, can execute those transactions. And once in a while, they will post a hash commitment to the ledger that results from executing those transactions. In the case of a zero knowledge rollup or validity rollup, they will post a proof that it's correct. So essentially, you post a transaction and then someone says, by the way, I've executed this transaction, here's the result. That's great. The proof can be expensive to compute, though. In the optimistic rollup case, they basically post what they say that the result is, and then someone can come and challenge it. So if it says like, but this is incorrect, and I'll prove it to you, and then you have some procedure on chain to a form of arbitration to decide who's right or wrong. And in both of the systems, you basically need a single honest party. In a validity rollup, if you have no honest party, then you have a liveness failure. Your thing will stop if you have zero honest party, and if you have one honest party, it will work. In an optimistic rollup, if you have zero honest party, you unfortunately have a safety fault. But as long as you have one honest party, which is not asking that much, like you have one honest person in the world who cares about this, then you have safety and liveness. So that's a rollup. In Ethereum, a lot of the rollups have been built by private companies raising money from venture capital and launching tokens. And they've been built as Ethereum smart contracts. So Arbitrum is an example. They've built optimistic rollup. I don't know if we should count Optimism because they haven't built this thing. They haven't built any of the security measures that make optimistic rollup. So they market them as such, but it's not
I
really
mean,
there.
that's true for all L2s right now. Well, I think there's some minor exceptions, but all the major L2s have centralized sequences. They have admin keys that can literally steal all of the funds.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you can steal funds, you can censor. It's pretty terrible, actually,
Yeah.
if you ask me.
But the difference between Arbitrum and Optimism is like, so they both have this. They both have basically these backdoors.
Yeah.
But Arbitrum, in principle, you could get rid of the backdoors, and it would work, where Optimism wouldn't.
Oh, how so? How wouldn't you be able to get rid of the backdoor on Optimism?
Because it doesn't have fraud proofs. So the part where you say like, oh, I challenge your result, it's incorrect, and you prove that the result is incorrect, is not actually implemented, as far as I know.
I didn't know that. That's
wild.
That is wild.
Whereas
I mean, there's an admin key anyway, but I was actually
Yeah.
expecting that to be to have been built out. That's
No, I don't
so
think
then
so.
you're just trusting the sequencer completely,
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah.
Wow, that's scary.
I'm surprised that the Coinbase went with Optimism as opposed to Arbitrum for their
I'm
base.
going to look into that more. I think this might make a very interesting thread. Wow, that's
Yeah, and I think it's because maybe like a lot of these businesses judge correctly that the market did not care, and so
yeah.
maybe it's the right business decision for them to do that. It just feels weird to me. But anyways, so the reason, and I'm not going to, the reason they have this like backdoors and all of that is because they can't really upgrade otherwise. It's really hard to have a form of how does it deal with bugs, for example? If you have an emergency fix for a bug, like they could have some kind of DAO and some kind of on-chain governance, but they don't have the possibility to fork. And forking
And
is
even if you do a DAO or on-chain governance, then your security of your L2 ends up just being a subset of the L1 security, and that's again a major trade-off. I just want to point that out. Continue.
Absolutely. And rollups are difficult. Like implementing a rollup engine is complicated. It's hard, and so people are getting simple contracts on Ethereum wrong. Like simple swap contracts are getting it wrong. So the odds of like getting perfectly a ZK rollup or an optimistic rollup right as a solidity contract is not great. And I don't like forking as a way of making governance decisions. in a sense of like saying like, oh well, here's a new version, everyone,
It,
run it
it,
if
it
you like.
it really should be the nuclear option. To fork
Yeah,
should be like the final thing in a long line of governance
yeah.
processes, in my view.
Well, it
Yeah.
depends. If you fork for like a clear security issue, of course you should fork. Like if
Sure,
if
sure. That's an
you,
easy one.
I'll tell you what, if one day we find that there's a if one day we find like a critical bug in Tezos, or anyone find a critical bug in Tezos, what I think would happen probably is hopefully they do a responsible disclosure, and when the disclosure is done, and if the bug is really critical, if it's a bug that just does liveness, you can wait. If it's a bug that affects safety, basically what will happen is probably a lot of loud breakers get contacted and basically just like stop validating. Chain comes to a halt. Hey everyone, there's a critical security issue. There needs to be a fork, and this is it. And if this were to happen, I think people will say, "Oh my God, they stopped the chain, it's not decentralized," and so on and so forth. But like at the end of the day, it's the most pragmatic thing to do. And hopefully, the best thing to do, of course, is to not have the bug in the first place, right?
Mm.
Don't write the bug in the first place. But
Well, yeah.
bugs can and do happen, and if that's the case, it's much much better to do that than to try to just keep running with a bug.
Oh, in those cases, I agree.
Yeah,
I had more of a governance chain split in mind, and at
yeah,
least
yeah,
in our
yeah.
previous example, in terms of let's avoid that as the nuclear option.
And so with an Enshrined rollup, if your rollup is part of your if your
Yeah,
rollup engine is part of your L1 protocol, you do get that protection. Like you get to say like, look, if anything goes wrong, it's tied to the L1. So the fate of the L1 follows the fate of
yeah,
this rollup
exactly.
engine.
And that's what makes it enshrined to me is that your sequencer is essentially part of the same validator set as the layer one for Tezos,
So
right?
that not necessarily. So there's two things here. One is what do you use for a sequencer, and the other one is what do you use for your rollup engine. Is your rollup engine running as a smart contract, or is your rollup engine directly part of the protocol? So let's talk a little bit about sequencers.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, there was a tweet I reacted to the other day, which was saying a decentralized sequencer is called a blockchain, and it's not completely wrong. So what a
No,
sequencer
I think that's good. I think that's really good. That's how I feel about some of the L2 stuff on Ethereum. You're just trying to solve the problem that blockchain's already solved, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
and the sequencers we've seen largely, so like the Arbitrum sequencer is completely centralized, and we've seen a few which are a little more decentralized, a little more distributed, like Espresso, for example, is trying to have. But at the end of the day, if you look at Espresso, they're using something like hot stuff. So basically, behind it, you have a consensus algorithm. Like
yeah,
you need someone to agree, and
yeah. You have to
you can
reinvent the
totally
wheel. That's what they're
yeah,
doing.
yeah. You can totally use your L1 as a sequencer. Essentially,
Yeah.
you can put transactions there and say, you know what, it's been sequenced by the validators. So if you're gonna have it, so okay, so what is the harm specifically you get from having a sequencer if it's a centralized sequencer? I would say it's quite different from the backdoors that you have in terms of like affecting the security of the rollup or upgrading it. Because the sequencer, what they can do is they can throttle transaction. They can decide that some transactions are going to go through directly, and the other ones will have to use the L1. So they can't censor transaction directly, but they can delay them. They cannot cause safety issues, and but they can extract MEV. So essentially, if your sequencer is evil, the amount of damage they can do is limited.
Yeah,
Um,
censorship would be the worst thing, I think, out of all those things, in my view.
right.
Yeah.
But they can't censor. They can throttle, but they can't really censor.
It depends how. It depends how important the roll up is, right, in terms of that ecosystem, because it could be effective censorship if, say, where you want to send a payment is on the roll up, for instance, right? Like so,
No,
so there could be instances of censorship in that case, right?
not necessarily. So, no, no. I mean, it depends. Most sequencers are implemented with a delayed inbox. So essentially, you're saying like send your transaction to the sequencer, but if the sequencer doesn't include it, you can send it to the L1, and then the L1 will include it. So basically, the penalty is like instead of having a 200 millisecond confirmation, you get like
But there might
like
be
2 seconds.
cases where you're dependent upon the having to transact on the roll up. I would imagine.
No, but even if it's on a rollup, because the rollup basically will take information, it will take its messages from two sources. It will take its messages from like what the sequencer said the order was,
Uh-huh.
and also from the L1. So you can bypass the sequencer.
Oh, okay, okay. No, that makes sense. So I suppose in that sense, if we're talking about the sequencer and the smart contract logic, which are the two
Yeah.
of the big things that are wrong in Ethereum, it's the smart contract logic that essentially is validated by the layer one in this case, in the case, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's what makes it enshrined.
So I find sequencer much more mild in terms of consequences.
Hmm.
And but if you want a decentralized sequencer, the question is like, does it make sense to have a decentralized sequencer, or should you just use your blockchain? Um,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that. The benefit of there's slightly different trade-offs. So on your on your blockchain, your latency is a political parameter. Like how quick, what should your latency be? Essentially says, who do I want to be able to participate on my network? Is it important that people can participate through Tor? Like, if you want people to participate through Tor, you're not going to have 1 second latency. Like, maybe you're going to have like 10, 20 seconds or even more between blocks. Or if you say, you know what, we're not going to have Tor, but we want people to be able to participate with Starlink, for example, like in the middle of anywhere with a satellite. Okay, so you have a certain latency. If you say, I absolutely want 10 millisecond latencies and everyone has to be in the same data center. So it's a decentralization choice what your latency is. And for an L1, because you want to have a diversity of validators, because ultimately validators can cause safety fault because of consensus. Because your validators can cause safety fault, you need them to be very decentralized, and it's important to have a latency that's not too low. If you're building a sequencer, the sequencer cannot cause safety fault. So conceivably, you could want to have a decentralized sequencer that makes the trade-off of requiring very low latency with the cost of having less diversity of participants, and an L1 that has much higher latency and broader. And that the closest thing to this is, you're probably familiar with this. For a while, Bitcoin Cash was considering using the Avalanche algorithm for pre-consensus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's exactly the same thing. Basically, it's saying we're going to have a high latency, very, very decentralized system for producing blocks. But then we have essentially another consensus algorithm, in this case Avalanche, acting like a sequencer for those blocks.
Yeah, I've seen that more recently, like the use of pre-consensus as a way to, do interoperability between shards, or as a way to. I've been seeing it popping up more and more in the kind of blockchain design space recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm off to mine. So far as the rollups we've considered on Tezos have been basically without sequencer, or rather using the L1 as a sequencer.
Right. So
Uh,
it does integrate the sequencer as part of the L1. Then, in the case of Tezos Enshrined rollup, there's one
yeah.
Enshrined rollup on Tezos, right? That's fine.
No,
Understand
no, no.
correctly.
There's an Enshrined rollup engine, but anyone
Okay.
can build a rollup on that rollup engine.
Okay.
And then on top of that, the goal is to build one big canonical rollup where most of the activity can take place.
Oh, but that hasn't actually been. I thought the foundation launched the one big roll up, or is that
No,
not the case? Oh,
no, no,
okay,
that hasn't
I
launched
see.
yet.
But
It's
the
a
engine is
work in
is live.
progress.
Well, I mean, it helps that you have 1,000. It's around 1,000 TPS, right? What Tezos is capable of today?
Something around that, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The L1 at least, not
There's the other
including
one.
the use of rollups, which to me at least, I mean, to me, this is why I'm viewing. I know the terminology gets a bit confusing, but this is part of why I'm viewing enshrined rollups, because it's part of the L1. I really view it as a form of L1 scaling, or
Yeah,
even monolithic scaling, because you're preserving composability and interoperability,
absolutely.
unlike you do in the quote unquote layer two scaling roadmap, what that Ethereum is very much deep in now, you
Yeah.
could say.
But there's this thing that's like very, 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 very few people know or appreciate, I think, is that even if you want to do monolithic scaling, you're better off doing monolithic scaling in a rollup than without a rollup.
Hmm.
And it sounds very, very weird when you say it that way, because like, oh, if you're monolithic, why not just do it at L1? And the first instance that I've seen of that design was a Flow blockchain. So Flow is mostly known for Top Shots. And in the Flow blockchain, you have your validators, and then they basically like order transactions and do all of that, and then you have one rollup running on top of it, a single one running on top of it. I mean, last time I checked the flow blockchain was a couple of years ago, and the way they would change their validator set was by stopping the change and manually manually restarting it.
Oh, that's insane.
Yeah, they
Okay,
were
that's
just
interesting.
that was insane. But there's this one thing that they got right, which is you're better off outsourcing your computation to a rollup, even if you're going to be monolithic. And there's several reasons for that. And it goes back to what I was saying. You want to have a very wide diversity of validators for your L1 because you're dependent on decentralization for safety. That's a terrible thing, by the way. Ideally, you would be safe without like caring about decentralization. You're not decentralized. We're not decentralized because we want to be centralized, but because otherwise it wouldn't be safe.
Yeah, decentralization is a means to an end, not a goal of in
Absolutely.
itself. Yeah, well said.
You want to be safe and you want to be censorship resistant, and we don't know any other way to do it than decentralization. If we could do it with just cryptography, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
So ideally, you want your L1 participants to be able to participate using a Raspberry Pi in the middle of the savannah on a satellite connection going through Tor. That's your that's a gold that's a gold standard, or I don't know, maybe sending pigeons.
Yeah.
They're trade-offs.
And then only a few thousand people in the world would be able to use it at the same time, right?
But here's the thing.
Okay.
If you're building your execution engine on top of that in a rollup, the rollup has a different trade-off because the rollup only need one honest participant. You don't need people around the world, you need one honest person. So you can have very, very large hardware requirement for your rollup because you just need one person. So in some sense, you could have, like your blockchain is like Raspberry Pi to run the L1 node, and then you need a machine with 50 terabytes of RAM and 128 CPUs and all of that to run the rollup.
Mm-hmm.
Because the question is like, will there be one honest person who can afford this machine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and I've been thinking a lot about sharding versus multiple enshrined rollups, which I have to admit they do look very similar to each other, just on the surface level. And I've been thinking a lot about what are the pros and cons between them, and a pro definitely is the type of what's the word I'm looking for? The type of efficiency, it's a type of, it's quote, an analogy might be compression, maybe, in terms of what you get with enshrined rollups, in terms of the requirements that it puts on the L1 validators, right? I was thinking also about the cons, say, versus a sharded approach. Like, wouldn't a con potentially be, and I could be wrong. I've heard a few theories about this, but potentially the history of the ledger, would part of it maybe get lost or be obscured, which does have privacy advantages on the other hand as well. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that as a con of an enshrined rollup versus a sharded approach.
So we have to be clear what we mean by sharding. So for example, the scaling roadmap that I have in mind for Tezos does have data availability sharding. So I think sharding works very great for data availability, but in general, when people say sharding, they often talk about execution sharding.
Correct. Yeah, I am referring to execution sharding. Yeah.
But even in execution sharding, there's different models. So one model is you're able to run two zones in parallel. Maybe you have some validators focus on one zone and some validators focus on another zone, and then they synchronize, and somehow you get shared security between the two.
Correct. That's fair.
So
yeah.
That's one model of sharding, but then you don't have a lot of cross communication happening, or cross communication happens with like a bit of a delay. So that's similar to horizontal scaling with rollups, where you have a bunch of rollups and then they communicate to each other by going through L1, which is, by the way, very close to what the Polkadot model is.
Oh, but hold on. So but that's interesting though, because if the enshrined rollups communicate through the L1, then the L1 becomes a bottleneck for cross enshrined rollup communication.
Not really, because all they need is just one hash. So basically, every rollup reads on the L1 what is the root state hash of the other rollups. And then based on that, they can get Merkle proofs and they can get all the information they want.
Yeah, but I mean, if you, but if you wanted to say send, let's go with an example. Let's say Bob is in enshrined rollup A,
Yeah.
and Alice is in enshrined rollup B.
Yeah.
What does that cross enshrined rollup communication look like? Because wouldn't the transaction in full have to be posted on the L1, or is that not the case?
No, that's not the case. What it would look like is you would basically, so what you would burn it on Enshrined rollup A. So you just burn it,
Okay.
and it appears in a state tree of rollup A as like it's been placed into a special part, like a special burn part.
Okay.
And then you would go on rollup B and you would say, hey, by the way, I have burnt this thing on rollup A, and here's a Merkle proof that it was burnt. And the rollup B is aware of the root hash of the state of rollup A because it's received that information from rollup from the L1. So basically, all the L1 has to do is tell every rollup what is the root state hash of every other rollup, and
Right.
that's not a lot of information.
Right. But I mean, the other rollup would still need to know what balance. I suppose the user themselves would then submit the information, and
Yeah,
then the rollup would validate it through using this hash of the Merkle tree,
that's
etc.
exactly right. Yeah. So
Okay,
that's
that
how you get cross-rollup communication.
okay, yeah, that makes sense actually. That's very interesting. And the big advantage, because my big criticism of Ethereum, right,
Yeah.
has been that it creates a terrible UX because it compartmentalizes everything into these different ecosystems and walled gardens, and that requires a lot more user choice and extra clicks, and interoperability will not be seamless because it's all different. But with enshrined rollups, the enshrined rollup engine, right, which
Yeah.
anyone could then spin up these enshrined rollups with, right, if I understand correctly, because they're all following the same engine, therefore they are all perfectly interoperable with each other and seamless, if I understand correctly.
It's partly that, but I think it's more partly into a question of business model. In some sense, the thing is like, do you see the development of this as like a scaling solution for L1 as part of L1, or are there independent businesses? And if in some sense, if all of this is built as like a public utility and that's part of the basically like general Tezos distribution, then
Mm-hmm.
the incentive is to make it all very compatible and uniform. Whereas in a model where everyone is just trying to have their own special sauce and competing with each other, you don't get as much interoperability. Um,
Hmm. That's an interesting dilemma though, because the thing is, with even though in a sharded system, like when you have cross shard transactions, that
yeah,
creates bottlenecks, right, and it's less efficient. Um, it's always interoperable. All the shards are always interoperable with each other.
they're
Yeah,
homogeneous.
yeah, exactly, homogeneous. But
Uh,
you're saying that is not necessarily the case with enshrined rollups then, because
on Tezos, it's free rollup. Anyone can come in and launch a rollup a rollup on Tezos. So the engine is enshrined.
yeah,
There's two ways you can be enshrined. One is the engine is enshrined, and
yeah.
that's true. And anyone can come in and launch a rollup on Tezos that does whatever they want using the enshrined engine. And then the rollup itself can be enshrined by and then it's more of a, I would say, of a social and political statement by saying, by the way, the L1 is like stands for this rollup. It's a special rollup. Uh, if there is a bug in this rollup, the L1 will fork to protect this rollup. It's not just like some application running on top of it. We consider it,
Mm.
but it's more of a social contract thing than it is a technological thing at this level.
No, I understood. I understand. I could see how someone could still potentially create these rollups with a different logic behind it. Nothing stopping that. But the
Yeah,
idea here, I think, is that, if you have it enshrined, if you have the possibility of it being enshrined, then you would expect it all to lean towards that common standard, which is
yeah,
not something that occurs with the kind of free-wielding, free market approach to Ethereum right now, which I loved when it came to programmability and dApps, and I was less of a
yeah.
fan of it when it came to scaling. Um,
Yeah, the benefit is like it gives you some innovation, I would say. Like clearly, there was a lot of innovation that came out of Arbitrum, and so like the fact that these people are competing, it does bring innovation. But at the end of the day, though, a lot of this is open source, and innovation can be replicated.
well, Tezos is a great example. I mean, it surely must have benefited from the enshrined rollup space in Ethereum, right?
Oh,
Be able to
absolutely.
do this.
I would say that like our Arbitrum, for example, was big inspiration in the design, and we did spot a few things that I would say Arbitrum did wrong, and then Arbitrum is trying to fix later on.
Mm, mm.
So we're not just blindly copying stuff, but definitely I would say like when thinking through the roller problems, like the work that Offchain Labs did on Arbitrum was extremely helpful.
Yeah. So the other part of my question, in terms of the trade-offs between sharding and enshrined rollups, which to me are my two favorite scaling approaches right now when it comes to blockchains. Another one is a scenario of fear, and I've heard different views on this. But in the case of enshrined rollup, there's a greater possibility of lost history in terms of transaction history. Because am I wrong
Mm,
in that assumption? Am I mistaken about?
No, I don't think that's true. You have data availability. The data availability is actually. Let me. No, so you'll have the same data availabilities that you would have for the chain. So those transactions are part of the history of the chain, and
Okay.
you can replace them.
And you can rebuild them. You can rebuild the transactions from the because that's something that I believe is possible with is it ZK Sync? I believe you're able to do that, right?
I mean, you're
You
able to do that with Arbitrum today, or with others.
okay,
The ones where you might not be able to do that if you use data availability committees, and those data availability committees don't
right?
guarantee
Yeah,
it.
we discussed that a bit out of order, and now we're in order. It seems
Yeah.
with the data availability communities. But that to me just seems like, well, I mean, we have the enshrined rollups, which is a very good way of L1 scaling, and then obviously you just want to enable L2 innovation. And
Hmm.
I'm not against the free market coming out with solutions. I just want
Right.
the L1 to be competitive as well.
Now, what you
Obviously,
lose,
yeah.
and then the funny thing, so when we talk about data availability or proof of publication, it doesn't mean that a year from now you're going to be able to download that transaction. All it means is that it was published.
Hmm.
But if we assume that there's one honest person who cares about archiving the transactions, like an archivist, then you'll be able to. Then as long as you have data publication,
Huh.
so data publication plus one honest archivist guarantees that you'll have
But
the history.
so maybe I wasn't mistaken then. There is the possibility of lost transaction history then.
But that's true for L1s. Like there's no incentive that exists today on Bitcoin, for example, for people
That's
to keep
true.
old
I
blocks.
mean, I mean, the assumption is that we'll have some great archivists out of the good of their heart, or maybe research purposes, or whatever it might be, to keep a full
Yeah.
history, right? I mean, that's the case in Bitcoin, that's the case in Ethereum, but it seems to me like keeping the data that occurred in a rollup versus the data that's already on the L1, it seems like the rollup data would be lost easier,
I mean, there
easier
might
to
be
lose.
more of it. So if
Or
there's,
less an incentive to keep, maybe is maybe a better way to put that.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there might be more of it, so that could be a
Uh,
problem.
but okay, with a sharded approach, there also would be more of it. So that's
Yeah, 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 yeah,
kind of
yeah.
on equal footing.
And then my
Yeah.
life philosophy has been, one is like, don't worry about storage. Storage is very cheap. Upload bandwidth can be expensive, but storage is super cheap. Like hard drives are very, very cheap. Don't worry about it. And also, don't worry about a single honest party. Like it, if these systems have any economic value of any importance, you're going to find one honest party. And if you can't find one honest party that cares about the system, then the system is not very relevant to begin with.
Yeah, no, you're right. No, and actually, I actually agree. I'm actually very comfortable with that security assumption as far as I'm concerned, which is really interesting. It really kind of brings together the best of both worlds, so to speak. And yeah, I'm very excited. I haven't the way interoperability works between enshrined rollups was very, very interesting to me, particularly to learn about how that works a little bit better, and the audience as well in the process. Um, Wow, very cool stuff. Another area. So I think we've. Is there anything you want to add when it comes to scaling and
Well, there's
Shrine
more
rollup?
form of sharding. So there's also like some people did sharding, which was more focused on like parallel processing, like having multiple CPUs. And I think
So
that's
that's the
uh,
Solana approach, right? Where they're not sharding, they're monolithic, but they're very focused on the ability for
yeah.
parallel processing. Yeah.
I think Zilliqa was doing this as well, but
Hmm.
it's a low hanging fruit because now everything offers parallel processing. So the simplest thing you can do, by the way, in terms of parallel processing, is doing parallel processing of signatures. Like everyone should do that. because you still have a single state, so you don't have to worry about this. But like signature verification takes a lot of time, so that you should outsource to as many CPUs as possible, or even GPUs. Then the problem with parallel processing is that fundamentally, once you've verified signature, most of the time that you're spending when you're doing validation work is not actually computing stuff, is loading part of your state. That's your bottleneck. Your bottleneck is IO, because loading things from memory is expensive. And you can be smart. So there's like the Tezos protocol has built-in caching. So contracts which are used very often are kept in memory.
Cool.
So that saves a lot on the IO. You could also try to move to stateless clients, which Ethereum is trying to do. But I think you get a lot of benefit just from like caching. Uh, and then the question is like, how much do you split your stakes? Because if you don't split your stakes, then you can have transactions that interface with each other, and you can't really parallelize them well because they have locks. And again, if you split your stake, you lose in you lose in composability. So there's different models
Hold
here.
on, loss of composability, but that's not the case. Not in a meaningful way, at least with Solana, right? Because composability is maintained, and
So
it
I
has.
know they do signature. I'm not exactly sure what they do in terms of parallel execution of contracts. The question is like, what happens if I have a transaction that interacts with a contract, you have a transaction that interacts with the same contract, and then you run them on two different CPUs, and they try to access the memory concurrently.
Uh, well, I mean, I suppose you don't run them on two CPUs, right? In that case,
All right. So
probably the software would just pass it. I would assume.
well, there's two things you can do, or there's more than two things. But one thing you could do is say like, okay, my contracts by default are going to be in 16 zones, and I'm going to run transactions for every zone onto a different CPUs, and then I'll have multi-zone transaction that I'll run after that will like do a synchronization. And so it'll be very cheap to do transaction that only focus on one zone, and more expensive to do transaction that focus on multiple zone. It's a simple model. The problem with this is essentially you kind of force your contracts to decide where they're going to be deployed. Another model is just optimistic parallelism. So you just like go parallel, and then if you have conflict, you re-execute at a later point.
Yeah,
Uh,
that seems to me a common solution. I think that's how Solana works. I don't know. I could be mistaken about that,
it
but
kind of
that does introduce a delay, right? But it's
it's not really
considering that.
delay. It introduces unpredictability in terms of fees, and it can also introduce weird games where basically like your transaction, you're thinking it's going to be cheap, but then there's another transaction that conflicts with it, so it gets integrated, and that makes your transaction more expensive to execute. So if you're trying to have a fee market, it makes it more
Mm-hmm.
complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but as you said, fee market's less important if the system scales, right?
Oh, also benefit of doing everything on UL2. If you do everything on UL2, your L1 is your mempool. And so there's a lot of limitation for smart contract execution on L1 that come purely from the fact that you want to prevent mempool spam. But if you've dealt with mempool spam at the level of the L1 and your transactions are from the L1, you don't have mempool spam on the L1, and therefore your L2 doesn't have to do any of the limitation for smart contract execution that would otherwise exist. Like this is super in the weeds in terms of execution, but like it's one of the benefits of having your monolithic layer as an L2 as opposed to an L1.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that is very interesting. And I think ultimately, I mean, it does on the surfaces of it, it looks very similar, doesn't it? Like in the enshrined rollup approach, and structurally speaking, at least in sharding, they seem to be going up the same kind of general idea. I mean, if I were to visually kind of draw what that looks like and show that to a layman, they'd probably think it's the same thing.
I
It's
mean,
not, but it's
I,
similar, right?
ideally to the
Yeah.
layman, what should happen is that they send their transaction, it's cheap and it's fast and it works,
Yes,
and
yes.
then and
That's
that's really all that should matters at the end of the day.
exactly, yeah, and that they don't have to think about what bridge to use or what layer 2
Yeah.
their friend is on or what the hell is even a layer 2?
Yep.
You know? Yeah, no, I agree. It just needs to be seamless, and that's my standard, and it's why I've been so against the direction that Ethereum has been heading into, and I think that's really unfortunate. Just to their credit, they are also pursuing enshrined rollups in the form of a ZK EVM, but those timelines are just so far out that I just can't take that seriously. Like whenever a software engineer tells me, "Oh, it's going to take 5+ years," I'm like,
Jesus.
Yeah, they don't have a clue. Like, you have no idea, do you? Like, whenever a computer scientist says 5+ years to me, I'm like, okay, well, enjoy your research project. This is not a product.
I don't know. If it's 5+ years, you don't do research. If it's 5+ years, you go to the beach for 5 years, and in 5 years, you ask GPT-6 to just write it for you.
Oh, there you go. That that has a higher likelihood, I suppose, of coming through. But yes, that would be nice. I suppose, the hope is that they'll side with our view on scaling and then, solve problems.
I wrote one of my most popular blog posts in 2017 was like, why not pursuing sharding for Tezos? And at the time, I was reading a lot of the sharding literature for Ethereum, and it just didn't make sense. I was trying to understand what it was, and I couldn't find a clear spec. And it's because it wasn't one. It was not a fully fledged idea. There was nothing workable.
Yeah.
And at the time, I proposed scaling by basically using recursive snarks. So recursive executing. So that's basically the principle of ZK-rollup. So I've been a proponent of that as a scaling approach for a very long time. When I met Eli Ben-Sasson in Palo Alto, who was working on Starks, he was focused on privacy, and I said, it's actually a great scaling technology, and Starkware has been focused on scaling. So I've been very much in that camp, and yet today I still think optimistic rollup are a much better fit than ZK rollup, because the cost of proofs in ZK systems, even the optimized one, is just so high.
Yeah.
The cost of compute per transaction, not even like the limitation of the ledger spec, just like actually computing the proof is just so expensive.
Yeah. I was listening to a Bankless episode recently, but it had Justin Drake on it, so it was interesting. And the title
is great.
Yeah, Justin Drake's interesting. At least he at least knows what he's talking about there. But the title of the podcast was a sci-fi roadmap, and that's very much how I felt when I listened to them talk about it, because they said that the proof, the ZK, the processing requires, in order to make that viable for Ethereum, they need to increase the efficiency of the cryptography 1,000-fold.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, and I was listening to that, I was just flabbergasted. Like, are you kidding me? That's like, you can't guarantee you're going to have those sort of cryptographic breakthroughs within that timeline, right?
But also the demand is the problem is like also the demand is going to keep going higher, because in some sense, maybe computing gets like 1,000 times cheaper.
Yeah.
But then people are saying like, oh well, now we want to compute this much more expensive thing. So it's like, if the problem is if your handicap compared to an optimistic rollup is 1,000x, then that's hard to that's a hard sell.
Yeah, and that's what made me really turn more recently from away from Ethereum somewhat, in terms of where I really see more of the future and the innovation, and I've turned more towards blockchains such as Tezos doing enshrined rollups and the on-chain governance, which I think is fantastic. And also, some other chains also have been doing some good work in relationship to sharding, like Multiverse X and Ton, and Near is actually also very close to making that breakthrough of fully sharding their system. And so those to me are some of like the big ones that are really pursuing sharding. But out of all of those, Tezos has the on-chain governance already in place, and in the others, it's still just a promise. So I know it's a spectrum, but that's something I've always really appreciated about Tezos is that approach, and how happy I was. Is like, oh my God, Tezos is now also innovating on the scaling front. That's great.
I got it wrong. I got scaling wrong, to be honest. I remember there was this AP. What was the name of this podcast? The Epicenter podcast.
Epicenter. That's right. Yeah, that was a good deep dive podcast.
It was. And in 2018, they asked me.
Still around, actually. Let's not use the past.
Oh, okay. It's still around. Okay, sorry. Well, I don't know. They haven't had me for a while, so I assume it was defunct.
Yeah.
But they had me in 2018, and they asked me about interoperability and scaling, and I was like, oh no, not a focus, and I was completely wrong. Basically, because I was very focused on essentially the censorship-resistant store of value, and I was saying like, well, if that's what you need, then fundamentally you don't necessarily need as much scale. You can have like payment channels, at a Lightning for payments, and interop. Because the blockchain doesn't really work because bridges.
So you used to be on the dark side back then, huh? Like,
I don't know if it's I look. I was on the on-chain governance and changing your mind and being able to evolve sites.
That's true.
But yeah, I was
matters, right? being able to change your mind is what matters most in the end.
And
It's
I didn't think of Tezos as an application platform early on. I mostly thought of it as like cryptocurrency, censorship resistant store of value. Yeah, you can build some dApps, but not the main focus. And clearly, there was more market demand for like application platforms, and this is also how Tezos was perceived. And a lot of the protocol upgrades that have happened over the years have been trying to turn Tezos more towards this type of functionality.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think also when Tezos was launched, or at least conceived earlier when it was conceived, I didn't think we quite, at least I didn't, and in your defense as well, I didn't quite predict the amount of demand that would be generated through things like DeFi. And I think that really upped, because I think a system like Bitcoin, it essentially can scale if you let it. Like you can actually just through like a monolithic kind of a brute force approach, I think you could actually meaningfully scale something like Bitcoin. But the moment you add programmability and you want the same type of security guarantees for, that DeFi ecosystem that you do for your A to B transactions, then I think that just adds a massive, massive demand on the blockchain. And in order for you to truly be competitive and stand out in the market, if you can meet that demand,
Yeah,
then I think that's really part of the holy grail, really, in the cryptocurrency L1 competition today. And
yeah.
it's great that Tezos recognized that as well, and were able to shift their course.
It will be funny if at the 11th hour, Bitcoin decide to say, you know what, fuck it, let's do data availability sharding and ZK-rollup and just end up like being massively dominant. But
I wouldn't bet on
thingers, I
it.
wouldn't know. That's the thing is like things are so bad that I don't actually think they're gonna. They will do the Starks, I think, at some point, but I think they'll miss the data availability because that's too much of a change. And without the data availability, you won't go very far because it's just like you can't cram that much state change inside
Yeah.
Bitcoin blocks.
And they even turned down drive chains recently. Paul Stork's drive chains. That was
Yeah,
a no-brainer. Like, I don't think they're the best thing in the world, but like, it's obvious that
yeah,
could be good for Bitcoin.
yeah.
And
I mean,
they shut it down.
rollups they should be much more okay with because I think the argument against drive chain is fundamentally saying like, oh look, you know, if you do the merge mining essentially, then and there's substantial fees generated, then everyone will have to do it. And if everyone has to do it, then it's back to being like a block size increase. So I get this argument that you really can't make it for
Oh.
uh for for rollup, but like the point is like given the rise of other L1s, I think they should be all head on boards. I don't think I don't think they do it for decentralization or technical reason. I think fundamentally there's like a bit of a like this fundamental hatred for just like alternative projects which are not Bitcoin, and some of it has been saying like, oh look, all they are shitcoin casinos, and if we do this, then this type of stuff will happen on Bitcoin, which will tarnish the reputation of Bitcoin. I still also think they're banking on basically like a lot of the dApp activity pissing off regulators, and therefore, and that's not happening on Bitcoin, and so therefore, like getting some sort of like regulatory protection for Bitcoin that's
That
not present for
reasoning
the
is
chain.
so backwards to me. Like, if Bitcoin is not pissing off the regulators, it's not living up to its original vision, right? I mean,
It's a very weird transition that's happened in a Bitcoin thinking.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, now I have people literally, right, when I talk about the security dilemma in Bitcoin, people are literally telling me, "Oh, but governments and BlackRock will protect Bitcoin's security," and it's like, wait, what? You just turned the whole thing on its head. Now you're the group Bitcoin is supposed to, transpose is the one protecting it. Like, this is not well thought out.
no, that,
Especially in a competitive market. It's insane to me. Yeah, it really is where we are today, and but that also gives us a lot of potential for growth, and for change. I think there's that
yeah.
latent potential in the market. Like, Bitcoin is number one and Ethereum's number two, and
I mean, Bitcoin's complacency, I would say, or ecosystem complacency has been like Ethereum's opportunity,
yeah.
and hopefully Ethereum's complacency is Tezos' opportunity.
Well said, well said. And that's where I think we are, right? I really feel like, Bitcoin in some ways failed. I mean, it's an experiment, so an experiment can never really fail if it teaches us something, right?
Yeah,
Um, But
experience is what you get when you didn't get what you wanted.
well, there you go. That's a fair way to describe Bitcoin as well. And I feel like the next iteration over that was really Ethereum, because if you think about Ethereum, how it improves over Bitcoin, it has it has programmability. It has a it has a sustainable security model that also even makes the system more scarce, right? Because of the fee burning. So it's actually
Uh,
economically more sound than BTC while also being more secure. And I think that if we look at that as an iterative process, like we have Bitcoin, Ethereum. And I feel if Ethereum fails to evolve, which is what it's looking like more and more, or evolve at least in a direction that at least we think is the right direction, then it seems to me that there's going to be a third major iteration of blockchains, and I think that's necessary. And I think the two things that I'm looking at is scalability. I think is obviously going to be the next big thing. I think in many ways it's how Ethereum actually gained an advantage over BTC in the first place, is the combination of scalability and programmability. And it seems to me like the third iteration will definitely be scalability, and I hope on-chain governance. But I also foresee a future where maybe we'll need a fourth iteration, and that one will have on-chain governance as
mm.
well as scalability. But I'm always hoping for the nicer outcomes. But so far it's been a rough road, and it's I think the road to hell was paved with good intentions. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, no, I hope. I think a lot of people are going to scale eventually. So for a while, there was just no good way to scale, and basically the research has progressed a lot in the past couple of years. So now there's a clear way to scale.
huge
And
breakthrough.
so for
Huge break.
Tezos, it's going to be about like I think we can be very early to scale, and the question is like how long we'll have a lead. In some sense, it's like a wonderful gift that Ethereum took so long to move to proof of stake. And I think
Yeah.
they're going to give to other ecosystems the gift of not scaling for a while, or at least not scaling properly.
Yes.
But it won't last forever. At some point, they'll do it.
I'm not sure. I think the incentives might be so perverse that it would take. So I mean, similar to BTC in the sense that it just
Mm.
won't scale, right? People thought in the early days of BTC, or when the block size debates in BTC, oh no, they'll just scale later. Oh, you just have to wait a few years. You're just being impatient. Like this was part of the narrative, and I'm starting to doubt if Ethereum will ever scale, at least in terms of a meaningful time scale. Like if it does it 20 years from now, who cares? It's already irrelevant by that point, right? So I'm doubtful just because of the skewed incentives. I really
Mm.
am, because if the L2 ecosystems continue to grow so dominant and without any form of on-chain governance and without any sort of treasury system, I mean, in my view, I think because it's off-chain governance, you have a type of centralized decision making there. And I think
Mm.
there's going to be a lot of power and there's going to be a lot of interest to prevent Ethereum from scaling its L1 by established layer twos in that ecosystem. Yeah, that to me is what's really making me doubt it. And whenever
Mm.
you're dealing with off-chain governance as well, and you say, oh well, if we measure the political process and there's these 10 people that decide, it's also a bit of a wild card, right? That's also hard to predict. Instead of looking at the behavior of masses, which are predictable, the behavior of
Yeah.
individuals are much more difficult to predict as well. So yeah, it's again it's a tricky bit, but I do see Ethereum still being dominant for a long time. But
Mm.
as an investor as well, there's so much more potential for growth in competing layer ones that can actually meet the demand. And I just think the utility of blockchain is so valuable, right? To just leave that value on the table, I think is just insane.
That's
Um,
I still don't know about that. So there's basically this. The question is like sometimes I guess like why scale Tezos when the blocks are not full, right?
yeah,
And the question I'm saying is like fundamentally, well, first of all, if we don't scale, then there's no sort of success anyway. But the other thing is there may exist applications who basically they don't need thousands of transactions per second, they need millions of transactions per second, and they're not going to consider being built or being deployed unless you're actually bringing that type of capabilities. But it's a big if. We haven't seen what they are, and we don't know for sure that they're there. And so it's going to be very interesting when this capacity comes online. Another
Yeah.
aspect we didn't touch, which is the economics of this. So
Yeah, I would like to discuss economics. We're actually touching on it now. In regards to why scale when there's no activity, I think it's about signaling. I think you need to signal to the market, we are ready for mass adoption, massive scale. And if you don't do that, it will never come. And you're just stuck in this
uh,
loop of mediocrity, in my view.
absolutely. And in
Yeah.
2021, people were saying, we were saying like, well, we have cheap fees, like fees are low on Tezos, and people would say, oh, well, fees are low now, but if you had activities, then it would be high, and so on and so forth. So it's also about like, it's not just about having low fees, but credibly low fees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Yeah, let's talk about economics, because I'm very interested in that. And
yeah,
specifically, I think let's start this off because I mentioned that Ethereum, in my view, has the ideal economic model in terms of tailflation.
yeah,
I did see there's a new development in terms of adaptive inflation. I'm curious how this all fits into this, but my criticism of of Tezos here
yeah.
would be that you're not doing a straight 50% fee burn, and the amount of fees that you're burning is, I don't remember what it was. Was it on smart contract creation, or I think
I- yeah,
where's
yeah.
the fee burn? It's a lot less than what Ethereum has, and from an economic perspective, that would be my criticism. Why not just do a flat 50-30% burn, or something
Uh-huh.
along those lines?
Sure,
Take it away.
I can get to that. So the first thing is that whether or not in a proof of in a when Ethereum moved to fee burn, they were still proof of work, and in a proof of work saying fee burn makes a difference. In proof of stake, it doesn't really make a difference because whether or not you burn the fee or just pay it to the stakers, basically is the same thing because the stakers are the token holders. So in some sense, it all balances out. It's less tax efficient. It's more tax efficient if you burn it because then you don't have because then it looks more like capital gains than income. But
Well, yeah, there's a close relationship, right, between stakers and
no,
but it's not quite a one-to-one either. Like, you don't have
it,
100% stake that's staked, right?
yeah, it's not 1-to-1, but it's close enough. In some senses, like it just basically goes back to the token
I
holders.
think
It doesn't
Tezos
just
is
get like
uh,
it doesn't get burned into it doesn't get like transformed into it doesn't get paid to electricity companies. It stays in the ecosystem.
yeah, but it seems to me that if you burn part of the fees, it does imbue it with the quality of a shrinking supply under high economic activity, and that, to me, economically seems to be a better design, like it being more attractive. As it being more, if it's more attractive, it will gain more value. The whole positive feedback loop that
I
happens
mean,
there.
it's more of a marketing thing. So right now, the Tezos supply inflates by about I want to say like 4.5% a year.
Hmm.
But if you just take your Tez and delegate it, you're getting 6% in reward.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that's
if
because
you
I think like 70% people are stake, or 70% of the supply. I think it was around that as being staked, which
something like
Tezos
that,
has got like the highest staker participation, I think, out of any chain I've seen. But
because it's
it's
just
unique.
delegation. It's not staking. Sometimes like there's no lockup.
Mm, mm,
Um, but if you look at it, so the way I compute it is basically it costs you nothing. You're not locking. You're just you're just naming a baker. If you do that and you get 6% and inflation is 4.5%, then I would argue that it's net deflationary by 1.5%.
mm.
And those are rough numbers, but like because if you have to look at it, this is nominal inflation, right? If you inflate and you just give the same amount of money to everyone in proportion to what they have, you haven't really inflated. Um,
But people that are, say, using it as using it to buy their coffees, and they're not delegating their stake, right?
why not?
Okay, I see your point now, because it's so easy to delegate. Like, then you can just count it as part of a total economic whole. Okay.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you're not locked up. You could delegate, and then when you pay your coffee moves to the account of the coffee of the barista, who is also
Isn't
delegated.
that isn't that too easy? Aren't you worried about, bad choices in terms of delegation then? That, to me, that strikes me as it being, it's too easy,
Well,
to
if you delegate
participate.
to bad bakers, they might not pay you anything.
Sorry.
If you delegate to bad bakers, they might not pay you anything.
Right, but I'm more thinking in the case of, because I assume, like, the delegation, that ties into the governance process as well. I would
Yes,
assume.
yes, it does. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
absolutely.
So to me, what I would be worried about is, And actually, and this might be a controversial one, but I'm actually, when it comes to governance design and blockchains, I'm more of an advocate of having high minimums actually and long lock-ins. And
Yeah,
the
makes
yeah, and
sense.
the reason for that is just to have more active and professional participants in
Mm,
governance, and like making sure they really have skin in the game. And that's where potentially things like slashing come in as well. But the long lockings actually can serve a lot of the same purpose. So to me, this strikes me as, in terms of the blockchain design aspect, it seems a bit, I'm worried that it's too easy compared
mm.
to more strict systems.
But so the bakers themselves are bonded. So the bakers have to have their own bond. It's not just all delegation. So the bakers are
Oh.
actually staking.
And is that in proportion to the amount of
Yeah,
delegation they get?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
So they
Oh,
first to have some skin in the game. And the other thing is like you can get away a lot. You can get away with a lot by
how long's the
having
bonding period?
about 2 weeks.
Okay, it's a bit on the short side. So I keep repeating myself, but I think I would definitely consider, if I give you one piece of thing that I would like to see maybe added
Yeah.
out of all of the things in this design. And this is I really apply this logic to a lot of governance designs,
Mm.
but have it so that you can bond for 2 weeks, but give them the option to bond for years and give them greater reward proportionally in order to skew
Oh,
incentives more towards the
yeah.
long term.
You don't want to be hex, so you
No,
know.
no, no, no. This is not hex, right? I'm not talking about that. But no, but like a bonding curve where like the longer you stake for, the greater the reward proportion is basically. The reason for that,
Um,
yeah, as you're
yeah.
skeptical, I can tell. I mean, it's shit. It's not great from a user experience perspective, but I think it's important from the governance, because I think a problem we've seen I think in Bitcoin at least, I felt like miners had. I think part of the problem in that governance system is that I don't believe they're well incentivized for long term decision making,
Mm,
because I think they tend to have like a time span of like 2 to 5 years
yeah.
in terms of their mind. They're very mercenary. So I suspect that in terms of a miner's incentives, in the case of proof of work and Bitcoin at
Mm,
least, it makes sense when it comes to decision making. It makes sense not to rock the boat, right?
yeah.
And maybe make a decision that's better for the short term as opposed to making a decision better for the long term. And to me,
Yeah.
it seems like in a proof of stake system, you can actually skew it more towards long term thinking by creating this lock-in. And proof of stake already, I think, is better in that regard, because they still have to actually hold the stake and be investors in the project, right? But that's
Uh, uh,
something generally I like to see.
but,
Polkadot
but
does that actually.
by
Yeah.
the way, that's why Tezos launched with proof of stake. It would have been much faster to launch with proof of work, and I think retrospectively probably the right thing to do because it could have launched, it could have gone to market before Ethereum. But we're not going to redo that. But the reasons I said it was so
Imagine how that would be a very different world, wouldn't it?
different.
Like,
Well,
Tezos probably would be the dominant blockchain if you launched before
there's a
Ethereum.
lot of other things that could have gone wrong, but
Yeah, yeah.
definitely a leg up. Um,
That's
but
if
the
you
reason,
launched with programmability, of course.
but
But then
the
I'm
reason to
certain of it.
launch with proof of stake was that I figured that there was a risk of this line incentive and that miners would basically block upgrades that to proof of stake.
Right. Yeah. I think Ethereum was worried about that as well, right? That's why they had the time bomb built into the code.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
So interesting. That's
yeah,
very
yeah.
interesting.
So longer locking periods for more votes is something you can consider. But in general, I would say you get away with a lot by just being very um, how should I say? By just being very conservative. If you ask for 80% threshold, it's like, yeah, it's not ideal. Like some people might have a stake and just like sell it after and so on and so forth. But it takes a lot for 80% of your money mass to somehow like be
Sure.
captured by bad interest. So
Sure.
the question is like, well, yeah, but if it's 80%, maybe you'll have some good proposals that won't pass because it'll be a little bit controversial. And then here my point is like, if your proposal is good, it shouldn't be. If your proposal is good, it shouldn't be that controversial. Like, there's a lot of things you can do that shouldn't be too controversial, and then you'll be fine. It's like most people would like the chain to be faster and to work better and scale better. Uh, but yeah, so back on what you were saying for for adaptive inflation or adaptive issuance. Sorry.
Yeah, because
So,
that's been a new feature for Tezos, right? The adaptive
yeah.
inflation. I did look into that briefly and was curious about that.
In some sense, it makes Tezos much more similar to how other blockchains are doing staking. So more similar to what Cosmos is doing, what's more similar to what Ethereum is doing. So here's a problem that we were trying to solve with delegation at the beginning. You don't know a priori how much you need to pay your validator for security. And on Tezos, the idea says in the original paper, it says, well, we want about 10% to be bonded, so 10% to be staked. And that's the stake that's owned by the baker, not the delegation, the actual stake, the thing that's at risk, the thing that can be slashed. You want 10% of that, but we don't know how much it will cost to attract that. So let's make it very high. Let's have 5% inflation, 5.5% inflation per year. So 5.5% inflation distributed to only 10% of the stake, that's 55%. So that's actually a very high number. We say that, well, 55% should be enough to attract people to stake for 2 weeks. If that won't do it, you have other problems. So we do that, but that might be too high. So how do we solve the fact that it's too high? Well, people delegate their stake to those bakers, and then those bakers will try to attract delegation. In order to attract delegation, they will likely offer to pay some of that reward that they're getting to pay it back, to transfer it directly to the delegates. And how much they decide to keep versus how much they decide to transfer will be a function of how much it costs to actually bake. And so in practice, what we had was something like, okay, so 5% inflation, and then they pay back, and then they keep 10% of that and pay back 4.5%. But now, because they're paying back 4.5%, not to 100%, but to about 70% of the stake, you end up with something that's actually higher than 5%. So that's the model, and it's adaptive in a sense, but the adaptation comes from bakers choosing how much of the rewards they're going to keep and how much they're going to pass on to the delegates. That's how it adapts to the actual cost of baking. When the problem with this is it's not depending on the jurisdiction, it can have a pretty negative tax treatment. So basically, in some sense, like everyone gets diluted by 5%. So all else equal, this might be reflected in a 5% capital loss. But then you get 6%. But that's income tax, and income tax rates are higher than capital tax rates. Plus, there's a hassle of like having to actually like file your income tax and having to
Yeah,
like
you're
count all of this.
you're right in
It's
that burning creates a lot less legal problems, and
yeah,
that's
a
something we've
lot
seen again and again.
a lot less.
Yeah,
Plus,
I'm conflicted whether that should lead our design philosophy, though. It's that's a whole nother question. But
you want to be user friendly, and it's not user friendly to ask your users to
yeah,
like say like, you know what, just stay anonymous.
you know
No,
what?
people
That's
don't want
fair.
to go to jail, and they should not go to jail. And so people pay taxes because they do not want to go to jail, and and not wanting to go to jail is a perfectly good thing.
That does seem very reasonable, actually. It does. Yeah,
So we would like people to be able to use to use this thing without having to pay a lot of taxes that they shouldn't have to pay, and without having to look behind the shoulders. So
yeah,
the adaptive issuance mechanism instead says, look, we're going to target a certain amount staked, and it should probably be higher to have higher economic guarantees for slashing. But we'll adjust it, and then depending on whether or not we reach this, we will adjust issuance up or down. So in the current proposal, it's sets at about 50%. So it will move from 10% stake to 50% stake, which is a huge increase, but which increases the security of the chain. But in those 50% stake, if you're above 50%, then the amount of issuance will decrease, and if you're below, then the amount of issuance will increase. And so in the equilibrium, it should yield a much lower total amount of inflation.
yeah.
I would, maybe you get around like maybe like another percent or some
Mhm. Now,
or
it
something of the
definitely
sort.
strikes me as being more efficient, right? And
Yeah,
I think Tezos is one of the only blockchains right now that is dealing with the problem of too much active participation in their governance and in their staking. Like, I think that's maybe a luxury of Tezos to be able to think and solve for that problem, because it's not a problem that any other blockchains are having.
no,
Yeah, it's. I think part of the reason why is because, I mean, it was such a governance centric idea. I think that it attracted, a certain demographic that happen
Yeah.
to be highly participatory when it comes to governance and staking.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's what it is, right? Like
It
it's
has its pros and cons.
yeah, yeah. I can imagine. I can imagine. You must have some hard case people at times. I suppose in this
Yeah.
community, I could definitely see how those two would come
Uh,
together.
so
Yeah,
it's closer to what Ethereum is doing. It's closer to what
yeah.
Cosmos is doing. It's more compatible with lending markets. So sometimes one thing will happen is people will say like, "Oh, I want to borrow some Tez." I says, "Well, it's the interest rate plus the delegation because I'm going to miss out on delegation." And they say, "Oh, but I'm not set up for delegating, so I'm not going to pay you that." Well, I'm like, "There's no reason you should be set up on delegating, but in practice, they aren't." If you like all the Tez that sits in an order book, for example, on an exchange, is probably not necessarily being delegated.
Mhm.
So there's all of this like kind of deadweight loss that comes from the
Yeah.
delegation system. Um, eh,
The cap on being a delegator is quite low on Tezos, if I
there's none.
remember.
You can no, you can be you can be a delegator with a fraction of a
Oh,
test.
sorry, I mean delegate. My apologies. I mean delegate.
Yeah. That's quite low. I think it's like 6,000 Tez or something like
Yeah,
that.
wow. Okay, so a lot of I've seen people criticize Tezos for being a quote unquote DPoS system, and I actually don't think that that's a fair criticism in my view, because I think traditionally when we think of DPoS, we think of things like EOS, which had a set amount of validators, like 21 validators in the case of
Yeah,
EOS, and I don't think that that's a fair comparison, because I mean the minimum, if everyone can quote unquote be a delegate, if the
yeah.
minimum is so low as in this case, it's actually lower than the minimum than it is to be an ETH validator actually.
No,
Then
that's totally right. The thing is
yeah,
like it's proof of stake. There's
yeah,
a delegation model.
yeah.
Uh, But so people say, oh well, it's then it's delegated proof of stake. Then it means it's like the DPoS model invented by Dan
No,
Larimer for
no,
BitShares
no.
team
Yeah,
and
exactly.
US, and it's
Yeah,
not that model. So
no, it's
early
not.
on,
This is
we got
direct
this
proof of stake.
confusion,
This is
and
definitely direct proof of stake, as far as I'm
yeah,
concerned.
so
It's not
we called it
DPoS.
liquid proof of stake to try to distinguish this from like
That's
DPoS
pretty
because of
cool.
the confusion around the world, the DPoS.
Like
But,
liquid democracy, I assume that's where the
yeah,
terminology is coming
exactly,
from. Very cool.
exactly,
Very
exactly
cool.
right.
I like it. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think I do think that that was a very unfair comparison. So I saw that comparison made. I'm like, no, wait a minute. And they have it backwards as well. It's like, and this is something that I've observed in Ethereum actually, is that because they don't have a native delegation system built in, what you end up with are things like Lido and Rocket Pool and all
Yeah,
these sort of external which services that end up propping up, making up for there not being a native system of delegation. So I actually think that not having native delegation makes your system more centralized, because you just end up it ends up happening anyway in like a non-native L2 manner, if you will, if you want to use that terminology. And I think yeah, so I think that criticism, a lot of people had that backwards in terms of how they were looking at Tezos. They really have it the
yeah.
wrong way around. Bless you. I have a few more questions here that we hadn't touched on, so these will be
All
a
right,
little bit random, but I didn't find a spot to squeeze them in so
please.
far. So, um, in the early days of Tezos, it was referred to as a self-amending ledger.
Yes,
Yeah, I think is that terminology still used today, or I think
I
it's
use it.
okay. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's true. It is a self-amending ledger because there is governance, and if you want to take a little break just to blow
No, no,
your
right.
nose, no, you're good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, um, that yeah, and I think, and it's more my fault of anything, but I really the concept I really like, but I think when I say self-amending, what I think of is like the code is on the chain and you vote on the code, and then it transforms into this new code. That's what I think of, but that's not actually how Tezos works, right? Because the way it works is people still need to go and download the new code off the GitHub, and then run it, right? So
No, no, they don't do that. No, no. You the code when your node upgrades, it basically grabs the code. It grabs the code from the chain, compiles it, upgrade
it
automatically
does.
update it. Yeah,
Oh, wow. How was it? Because I did look into this. It was actually part of cyber capital research, and we came to the conclusion actually that that was not the case.
no, no,
Uh,
no.
Wow.
It's
So it does actually grab the code, like the code is actually stored on chain then.
so technical detail here.
Yes.
So you will grab the code from the mempool. Like essentially, the code is grabbed from the peer-to-peer network. So
Oh,
if you ask your peers for like, give me this protocol version, they will give your node this protocol version. Your node will be able to compile it, to run it, and to hot swap it.
wow.
Uh, uh,
On the mempool.
the
Okay.
chain the chain does not guarantee the data publication of the protocol. So essentially, there's no guarantee. So it's there's no guarantee of data publication, but the assumption is that if 80% vote for it, then it's available, right? So the data availability is like, well, if 80% vote for it, it means it must be available, because
Right.
otherwise, why would it be there?
And then
But
I
it's purely you get it purely from the peer-to-peer network.
wow, wow. So it actually is going through the mempool. I had no idea. Yeah, I thought it was just the case that you were just voting on the hash, right? Like as you explained earlier. But if
You
it's
are voting on a hash.
you are, you are.
You are voting
Yeah.
on a hash,
Yeah,
but
which corresponds with the code that's in the mempool.
but the assumption is that if you're voting on a hash, you've looked at the
Right.
code.
Yeah,
But
okay.
if I run a node, let's say I'm not participating, I just run a node, right? And my node
Yeah.
is just following the chain. When my node detects that the vote has happened and there's a new version of the code, it will get the code from the peer-to-peer network, compile it, and run it.
Really?
Yeah.
Does that automatically? I
Yes.
suppose that could be configured, obviously, but wow, that's really fascinating. So it's actually more self-amending than I thought it was. Then, that's actually, and I assume anyone could upload new code into the mempool
Yeah.
and initiate a vote.
Yeah. We call it
Beautiful.
injecting a proposal. Yeah.
That is beautiful. I love that. That is just fantastic, isn't it? There's something really beautiful about that, isn't there?
It's beautiful. It was probably overkill. Like from a pragmatic business perspective,
That
it's
probably is
probably
overkill.
overkill to do it, but it is so cool.
It's so cool,
They
but it
can do that.
really makes it feel so much more organic. Like it's a living thing almost. It's a
It's
living,
just
breathing thing.
once again, it's a question of scale. It's like at the scale of Tezos, it's overkill. It's overkill. If Tezos was like so embedded that like you had nodes running in like a bunch of smart devices around the world and a bunch of ATMs and so on and so forth, and basically that it didn't have like regular human maintenance and babysitting, then it would be super helpful. Like then you would have all the ATM in the world who are connected to the Tezos network, for example, grab the code, automatically update it. Then it would be very useful. When it's a community of like 400 or 500 bakers, it's a bit overkill.
It's overkill, yeah, and I can agree with that. But as you said earlier, it's also better to have now than not have it at all. That's
Yeah.
especially when it comes to anything that touches on governance. It's very interesting, and I suppose they'd have to pay a gas fee of sorts to upload it into the mempool. Because if it's
No.
not confinalized, then you don't pay a gas
Mm,
fee, right? If it
no,
doesn't go
no.
with blocks, how does that
So
work?
you don't really upload it into mempool. It's more like you have peers, and your peers ask you, "Have you seen this protocol?" And if you have this, and it gets gossiped.
Oh, it's okay. So this is more like this is not literally in the same mempool as transactions. It's like a
It's not.
secondary network,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
a
Well, no,
secondary layer, I should say. Yeah.
it's the same network, but it's not literally in the transaction mempool. I don't think
Oh,
so.
okay. It's like a separate mempool just for this purpose. Okay.
Yes. For gossiping
How
protocols.
how does the like how do you protect against like spam attacks against something like that? That's the first thing that comes to mind, obviously.
Yeah. So essentially, first of all, it's pool. Like you're not pushing these protocols to other people. Like you have to ask other people for the protocol, and then
Okay.
nodes keep track of how much bandwidth you're going to your peers, and if your peers are like either if you're giving you bad transaction, if they're not giving you new bandwidth and asking you for a ton of bandwidth and so on and so forth, then you end up disconnecting for those peers. So it's a set of heuristic at the level of the peer-to-peer like library that protects you against spam.
Yeah. No, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That seems like that would be a sufficient protection in that case. Yeah, that's super cool. And yeah, it does seem like that gives it an extra kind of layer of robustness, let's say. Because GitHub is like, it seems so ironic that you have to go to this centralized website
Yeah.
controlled by people who control the central key to the website,
Yeah.
and that's where we're all downloading our code from. It's such an obvious
Mm.
point of attack, you know?
Yeah. No, and no, the protocol will download the code from peers. It will hash it It will check that it matches with the hash of the protocol
Ooh,
that's been
wow,
accepted.
that's voted on. Yeah, because that's interesting. Because that actually, that you could argue that's a much better security guarantee than your GitHub download, isn't it? Because now you have the consensus of a layer one blockchain confirming that this is the correct code, as opposed to, hoping that, your GitHub keys weren't compromised, right?
So my thinking originally around this is like every software you use today has auto upgrade, like whether it's your operating system, your browser, your phone, it
Yeah.
automatically upgrades. And the way it's secured is that it knows the signature of the vendor. And so when
Yeah.
Microsoft pushes an upgrade, your operating system will check that it's been signed by Microsoft. So it's the same thing. It's an automated upgrade push, but you verify that it's been signed by the governance mechanism in some sense.
Yeah. And this governance mechanism is decentralized, which makes it far more secure. Wow, that's fascinating. I was thinking like one day this could be applied to more software than just node software, but that's probably even more steps beyond what's necessary than where that's already at.
So I think I should clarify what I was saying a little bit earlier about client
Sure.
diversity. This is why like you can have client diversity in Tezos around the shell, but around the
Yeah.
protocol itself, because it's like this fundamental thing that actually like the source code gets gossip around the network and
Mm,
so on and so forth.
mm.
Then the definition of the protocol is its implementation in this case.
It sounds like the way you're describing it, that the protocol client, if you will, that is all consensus critical. Like this is very like the base layer stuff. And it seems like the shell would contain some of the logic that doesn't have to be in
Consensus
sync
critical.
with
Yeah.
consent in order to be
Yeah.
in consensus.
Exactly.
That
Exactly
makes
right.
perfect sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Then I would really just see the clients as being the shells, sorry, as
Yeah.
being the competing clients. And you don't
Yeah.
actually need like protocol diversity in this case would be having multiple chain splits, which is
Yeah.
protocol client diversity would be multiple chain splits, right? Yeah.
My original vision was that the shell would basically barely change. Like we would have a fixed shell, and then everything would happen at the protocol level.
Yeah.
Uh, and we ended up having a lot more shell upgrade than initially planned. And fundamentally, it's because sometimes it's been easier to do shell upgrades than to do protocol upgrades because it touches on. So let's say, for example, when when we added sapling, which was the Zcash style transaction available in smart contracts on Tezos, one option was to re-implement everything inside the protocol in OCaml. The other option was to use the Rust library and make that as available as a system call for the protocol inside the shell. And in that case, like changing your shell is way easier than it
Mm,
is to like doing it in the protocol. And
yeah.
so like for a lot of pragmatic reasons, we've ended up like having a shell that moved a lot. I'm hoping that we get to a point where essentially the shell doesn't have to change all that much. And in fact, I say with Enshrined rollups now, we're getting to the point where I would say not only is the shell not going to have to change as much, but the protocol might not have to change as much because you can do more on the rollup side.
Mm,
But
yeah.
yeah, I would say like the trade off over the past few years has been stability. Like stability is important if you're very big. If you're not an incumbent, you want to be nimble and quite fast.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think you beat Ethereum to the punch by at least 5+ years if we take their own predictions into account. So yeah, no, I mean that trade off as well is an important one. And, talking about being competitive. I'm curious about because it's tricky. It's tricky to differentiate yourself, to really gain that community, to gain that real value. What are your thoughts on how to really grow the Tezos ecosystem and Tezos DeFi and Tezos adoption? Is there anything that really sparks your interest there, or where
In
you see a
DeFi,
lot of hope? Go ahead. Yeah.
well, so I think DeFi is super interesting, and my background is in financial engineering. So and I got super interested in Uniswap early on. Unfortunately, it took a while for this to pop up on Tezos, but like perpetuals, I find fascinating. It's an innovation that came from DeFi that didn't exist in traditional finance.
Mm,
So perpetuals protocol are super interesting. There's also an opportunity for design of dexes that we haven't seen. The cow swap, for example, on Ethereum is quite interesting. So it's an area where we can see a lot more novel things, because the thing is, if you are a traditional exchange, traditional regulated exchange, any single innovation you're going to do is not going to be a technical venture, it's going to be a legal venture. It's going to be years and years and years before you can try anything. And
Yeah.
here we've seen a lot of innovation and seen a lot of new interesting designs. Where I would criticize DeFi is that fundamentally finance has to finance something. What are you financing? And if all you're doing is just trading token, if you all of DeFi is doing is trading other DeFi tokens, it's kind of a country that has no it's like, what are your exports? Like, what are you producing?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And for that, unfortunately, I think we need probably some form of real world assets, and that causes its own. There's a bit of an impedance mismatch between the compliance requirements that go around real world
Well,
assets
I mean, there's
and
some
DeFi.
money to be made between lenders and borrowers. Nothing crazy in terms of APYs, but I do think that's still a valid use case, right?
Yeah, no, borrowing and
Yeah.
lending
Yeah.
and trading, but I would say the scale that it would have, if you have a way of making permissionless DeFi work with permissioned assets, which is a hard circle to square, but if you
Yeah.
can do that, the scale of what can be traded gets much bigger.
I'm a bit skeptical actually of the use of real world assets on chain, and I think you've probably also correctly identified the problem. I think it's twofold. I think there's an Oracle, bless you. I think there's an Oracle problem,
Mm.
and there's also an enforcement problem. Because I think one
Right.
of the things that a blockchain does, if I do an A to B transaction, right? Like
Mm.
if I'm just sending Tezos to you, the
Yeah.
blockchain knows if that's valid or not, and it can actually enforce that. Now,
Mm.
in the case of, say, if I'm transferring a property share to you,
Yeah.
right? Who's enforcing the ownership? Is it the blockchain that's enforcing the ownership, or is it the local courts that are
Yeah.
enforcing the ownership and men with guns on the ground, like
Yeah.
telling you, get out of this man's house, please? Right? So, like, that to me seems to be it might be one of those cases where it doesn't solve that problem. But
Okay.
I'm open to ideas around it, certainly. And I'm
I
curious to
think
hear
I, ca-
your
I think
thoughts.
I can convince you
Okay.
for real
Ooh,
world assets.
interesting.
So the first thing is, like, whether if you own a Tez or not own a Tez, courts are still going to get involved. If, like, if somehow you beat up someone in the street and you take their Tez and you put them in your wallet, and then there's a police investigation and they catch you,
Yeah.
they will force you to return the Tez to that person.
Yes.
Now they may not succeed in forcing you. Like, you can keep possession of it, but, like, in
Yeah.
terms as far as the law is concerned, there's the owner, and you don't own it. You just have
Yeah.
possession of it. So possession is still 9/10 of the law. So there's two viewpoints which are wrong here. One is a viewpoint of saying, like, oh, the blockchain means nothing because it's only courts that decides ownership, and
Mm,
therefore who cares what the ledgers say? Well, it does
mm.
matter because possession is 9/10 again,
Fair point.
and, like, in practice, it can be quite expensive for people to sue you to try to recover this thing. So having control does matter, regardless of what a contract might say or what the law might say. And then the second aspect is to say, like, oh, well, if the courts can say any, it's the other thing, which is to say, like, well, if the courts can say anything, then the blockchain means nothing. No, again, because there's this aspect. So for something where it's purely on chain, like a cryptocurrency, obviously that's where it's going to be strongest. Whereas if you have a real world assets, then there's a legal avenue to sever the relationship between the assets and the ownership. So the value of the chain here is going to be weaker, but it's not zero. If I'm trading in assets today, I have to trust a lot of things. First of all, I have to trust that the asset is going to be honored. Just because I have a stock doesn't means that, if I have a stock in a company, I'm entitled to dividend, but it's still, like, it's a liability. I still have to trust that it's going to be paid to me.
Mhm,
Maybe a court is going to say, like, actually, you're, in default of something, we're going to call the dividend that you're getting, or something like that.
mhm,
So
mhm.
you have to trust that, and I have to trust the custodian of that security somewhere, and I have to trust the exchange. So there's a lot of intermediaries that you have to trust through the process. And if you can remove all of them but one, which is, like, the link between the asset on the chain and the real assets, you've made some game. You've not gone all the way in terms of, like, eliminating trust, but you've removed a lot of trust, and you've removed a lot of cost that comes with it.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
fundamentally, because you have to the fact that you have to trust a lot of intermediaries in traditional finance not to commit fraud.
So
Because
okay, so I think in theory, I think that's correct, right?
yeah,
Because you can eliminate that, and then you can accept, like, if you say have a token of a share, right?
yeah,
You're trusting the leadership of that company anyway, right?
yeah.
I think that's part of the argument. You already have layers of trust. The problem that I start to have though is that the benefits gained by tokenizing, right? So I
Mhm.
think technically you're correct. Where I have more doubts is that in practice, right? As far as I see, most of the benefits of tokenizing come from, being able to trade it on a decentralized exchange, being able to put it into lending
Yeah.
protocols, being able to spend it seamlessly. Like, I could get my Apple stock and buy coffees with Apple stock. Like, I love this stuff. I think that's a future I want to live in.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. It seems to me like that advantage that might exist here and there, in reality, there are, projects that have pulled this off. But it seems to me that it's just a form of temporary regulatory arbitrage, because that's the reason why that's not possible, say, with centralized, Web 2 systems, is because of legal reasons. It's because of regulation. It's, no, you have to KYC AML every person when you transfer. Oh, you need to have, a minimum investment
Yeah.
accreditation, etc., etc. Oh, you need anti-terrorism financing law. And then
Mm.
once you layer all those things on top of this, say, wrapped stock token, if you will,
Mm.
security token, then you lose all of the benefits. Once you've made it consistent with what, like, Web 2 or traditional finance does. So either, because I think these two will become consistent with each other. So either the law changes to
Mm.
accommodate for what tokens are capable of, or the law starts to encompass what security tokens are capable of, and then they lose their benefit. So this is the
So
kind of dilemma that
uh,
I've run into.
so I have a response to that. There's a difference between a system. There's a difference between like basically non-compliance and regulatory arbitrage, right?
Mm,
So if what you're saying is like, oh well, the point of that DeFi is non-compliant, and therefore, you have this benefit, but if it were compliant, then you would have no benefit, and so on and so forth.
yes, that is what I'm saying. That's an accurate
But
assessment.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's a matter of non-compliance. I think it's a real regulatory arbitrage. In the same way that incorporating in Delaware as opposed to incorporating in New York State is a form of regulatory arbitrage that most U.S. corporation does. Why? Because the law is better. And so the question is like, why do all the regulations exist? And originally, I would say a lot of the reason for those regulations is because you have intermediaries, and intermediaries in finance can commit a certain type of fraud. They can basically like
Yeah,
siphon money out, and no one notices until it's too late and all the money has been paid. So like you have long-running frauds like Bernie Madoff, for example.
yeah,
So a way that you can, and fraud is of course is illegal. The problem is that if it's illegal but you don't catch people because it takes 20 years to notice, that's a problem. So regulation is created so that you either if you comply with the regulation, it makes it very hard for you to commit fraud. So one type of regulation is that, well, public company needs to have accounting audits, and then we need to make it public. Why is that? Why is that? Well, because if you do that, it makes it very hard for them to commit certain types of fraud because there's these checks which are present. If you remove the intermediaries, you remove the possibility of fraud. And so if you remove the intermediaries, you say, well,
you
all of
remove the
these
need
regulations
for the
that apply to
regulation.
intermediaries, it's no longer there. And therefore, my regulatory arbitrage is that I
Mm,
don't have to comply to this regulation because the regulation was created for intermediaries and because there's no intermediaries. But in fact, you've really solved the problem. You remove the intermediaries that could commit fraud, so you've removed the need for the regulation.
mm,
Now, that's the optimistic scenario. The bad part is that a lot of this regulation that were created as a form of fraud prevention in finance, they've been used as a form of financial surveillance. So the entire financial surveillance apparatus has been built on top of financial regulation. And when regulators now are looking at DeFi and a lot of these ecosystems, they're saying basically like, oh, it's unregulated. And they're like, well, yeah, there's no intermediary. So your regulation for an intermediary doesn't apply.
that's a really good point.
And they're like, oh, but then we can't surveil it. And there's a tweet by Neeraj is like, I'm sorry that your financial surveillance state assumed that they would always be intermediaries. And that's why they're trying to say, like, well, the developer is an intermediary, or the website is an intermediary, or the wallet is like a broker. It's which is complete nonsense. But the reason they're doing it is because they say, like, oh, well, those regulations are convenient for financial surveillance. And that's probably the hard, like the reason to be negative. If those were purely financial regulation and not surveillance regulation, I would think that this would work much better. But that's where the crux is.
Yeah, you have a point. And I think it is dependent upon what the regulators will do, right? And if they will recognize that. And that's a really good point, that because there's no intermediaries, you don't need regulations, because it's you know who you're supposed to be protecting the user against themselves.
And that's the
Right?
thing. It's like money
Yeah.
transmitters have to have a bond.
Yeah.
Okay, why do money transmitters have to have a bond? Because they could run away with the money.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it's convenient because money transmitters are a good way where you can
Yeah.
monitor like money transfer. Now enters a blockchain. Now you not transmit. There's no way of there's no possibility of running away with the money
Yeah.
because it just happens on the chain. But people say, but it's still money transmission because I want to survey it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, you have a good point. And I think, but the question does then hinge a bit upon what happens with the law, with regulations, and how it treats cryptocurrency. So we could maybe say that that future of, true security tokens, that's, let's say, more likely in the United States than it is China. I think that might be also part of a fair assessment there.
My guess is that what's going to have to give is going to be KYC. So in some sense, you'll get like, if I had to venture a guess, essentially like whitelist your address once. You do some KYC, whitelist your address once or like once a year, and then after that, once you've done that, you're part of like a pool where you can have a lot more permissionlessness. Like I don't think we're going to see like real world like a lot of real world assets traded without KYC directly.
Yeah.
But I think we can limit it at that
Aave,
and still have a lot of regulatory arbitrage advantages over centralized systems.
Because Aave did that. They had a whitelisted pool.
Yeah,
But it never really took off.
No, it didn't. So that's an argument against what I'm saying.
But I don't think it's a good argument per se. I think it's. I mean, I talk to a lot of institutional type parties, and they're very uncomfortable with a lot of crypto. I think most institutional parties I talk to don't want to invest in cryptocurrencies. They think it's risky. They don't understand it. So
it is risky.
Yeah,
they're not wrong.
they're not wrong about that part. And so I can kind of understand, like, okay, if they have a lot of hesitance to invest in a registered fund in the Netherlands, which is what the fund that I run, Cyber Capital, if they have hesitance there, then I could imagine even more residents in an Aave lending borrowing pool, even if it's whitelisted, right? Because as a registered fund, we do a lot more than just simple KYC. So yeah,
no,
okay,
absolutely.
So the potential for that could very well come. That's really interesting, by the way, because I think you make some fair points. It's just I dislike that it's so dependent upon the regulators, but I think some things just are in life, whether we like it or not.
It's pragmatism. I don't like it. I don't like it either. But
yeah, that's the world we live in, right? That's the world we have to operate under.
And there's two levels to not like. One is a question of like, should we have like regulation, or should we have basically like a more libertarian system of like certifying entities and like voluntary self-regulatory organization and this type of things? That's like level one. And then level two is like, okay, even assuming that you're going to have some form of financial regulation, the fact that the regulation is being like twisted and used for political ends as opposed to like its original purpose, which is just like prevent fraud,
Yeah,
is a bigger problem.
Yeah, I'm curious. What is it that motivated you to first get into cryptocurrency? And I think you got in very early, like I did as well, even earlier. I think. And like, what was it that motivated you to come into this space? Because I think we're touching on that a little bit here, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was an intersection of many things. So first, there's a political project around it. I was running at the time the anarcho-capitalist lunch meetup at in New York City. So I come from like this very strong like, libertarian philosophy. So there was the whole agorist aspect of like.
So we have that in common. I think we were both part of the libertarian / anarchist wave that came in.
Yeah.
When that was 2012 to 15 or so, was that wave?
I heard of
2011?
Bitcoin super early on, but like I
Yeah.
started becoming more interested in 2011.
11. Yeah, yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. So you're at like that's like the front end of the like the first real anarchist libertarian slash people that came in,
Yeah.
anarcho-capitalist, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I came in 2013, so I was part of the later part of the libertarian
Mm,
wave, but before the Wall Street wave, fortunately.
mm. But Wall Street was quite. I mean, there's Wall Street and Wall Street. Like I was working as a quant on Wall Street, and like a lot of
Yeah.
my quant friends were interested because, and this is the second aspect. There's a whole like,
Mm,
hey, it's financial technology.
yeah.
Like it's really interesting technology. So it's an intersection of like cryptography,
Yeah.
distributed systems, the theory of money in banking. It was
Mm.
a huge
Wow, that was
monetary.
really a perfect storm for you then, wasn't it?
Oh
Because
yeah, yeah,
your
yeah.
interest in
It's
anarcho-capitalism combined with financial IT technology, it's really a perfect combination of backgrounds, I think. Especially, for some of us from the early days that I think now I meet people that were really born into cryptocurrency. I got into Bitcoin when I was 16. It's like 10 years later. It's like, oh wow, these people have really grown up with it now.
yeah.
It makes me feel a bit old, but
Well, that's thing.
yeah,
Imagine, for example, that you don't really pay attention to what's going on until like you're 7.
yeah.
So if you were 7 when Bitcoin came out,
Yeah.
you're now 20.
Yeah, exactly.
So like there's a bunch of 20-year-olds for whom Bitcoin has existed as long as gold.
Yeah, 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 exactly. In terms of their
Just
mental state,
yeah,
at least. Yeah, I agree. It seems, and I think it was really, I think for us coming in at that time, it was really about finding what skills of our previous lives kind of apply to this. And
yeah.
that's also where I found my fit in terms of, I have a philosophy background myself, and
Ah,
I think clear
well,
thinking goes a long way, I think, in this space. So yeah.
Casting, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, is also a philosophy major.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Cool. Very cool. Yeah. It's no, I found it very useful. Allow me to, not join the tribe or join the cult so quickly, I think, and
Mhm.
really question things. There's a lot of bad arguments flying around, and political philosophy, if I were to define more narrowly what
Mm.
my background was, and that really pulled me in. And I was like, okay, I can actually apply this. And
Yeah.
a few years later, I'm a blockchain expert, researcher person now. So here I am.
Well, definitely with the political philosophy aspect, I think is important. With the it relates to the on-chain governance.
Yeah, yeah, which
Like
is which
very
is
very
why
deeply.
it's one of my specializations, really, as a researcher. I think that's the area that I've spent the most time on, is thinking about on-chain governance, and that's why I was so involved in the block size debates, and why I'm so loud now when it comes to what's happening in Ethereum. And I usually caveat it: your scaling roadmap is terrible, and if you had better governance, this this wouldn't
Yeah.
happen. Yeah. So I was thinking, it'd be cool to go over some questions from Twitter, since
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
I usually ask the audience, what should I ask you, and I think that people enjoy that. So I'm going to see if we have anything worth it. Oh, here's a good one. This is a tough one. This is from Cardano Yoda. You can guess which community he's from.
I want to say polka dot.
Nice one. Yes. He's asking the question, and I already know the answer to it, but I'm gonna let you
Yeah.
answer it because it's a tough question. Why 5 out of 20 blocks are produced by the Tezos Foundation?
Is it 5 out of 20? No, I think it's I think it's less than that. I think maybe they took it's a bit less than that, but
Okay.
it's not a whole lot less than that.
Hmm.
I think it might be closer to 15% or something like.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
actually know the number
that's
offhand.
fine. That's fine. I
Um,
assume that can
well,
vary.
the reason is that the Tezos Foundation got an allocation of 10% of the of the stake. Which was a very small allocation compared to what a lot of other projects have done
I
after
wanna
that.
I wanna pause on that for a moment. I
Yeah,
I, I do the 10% thing. Wow, because I remember like Ethereum got a lot of grief. They also had a 10% pre-mine as well. They got a lot of grief for like, oh, centralized distribution, da 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 da. And
yeah,
you did 10% as well. And it's like
it was
today,
10%, but yeah,
today, every new blockchain I
90%. Yeah,
investigate, every single one is like plus 50% is low for today's standards, and it's just
Oh, and
gross.
they dice it. It's like, well, this is for grants, this is for the foundation, this is
Yeah,
for the company, this is for
yeah,
developer incentives. So
yeah,
like you have all these colors in the pie chart, but at the end
yeah.
of the day, it's still like 80%.
Yeah, and this is what I do. This is what I tell. And for the audience listening as well, this is what you do. You look at how much the public sale is, and everything else is a pre-mine. Don't believe any of those other categories, because
Yeah,
ultimately they're still in control of that. So yeah,
yeah,
so I like 90%, I see that all the time. 90% pre-mines, 70% pre-mines. It's terrible. And as an investor in the space, it's frustrating because I'm a fundamental investor, so I have like key things that I'm looking at in terms of
yeah,
like what makes a good cryptocurrency. We used to be, okay, nothing above 30% pre-mine. So we're not
yeah,
going to invest in anything that has higher than a 30% pre-mine. And I'm an investor in the space, and nothing has such a small pre-mine now. Nothing. It's all
uh,
just so damn greedy. It,
yeah.
it really is. It's so damn greedy. And I really, that's one thing. It's one of the few areas in cryptocurrency where I can say we've moved backwards. In most other areas, we can say there's like
Yeah.
constant progression, but this is an area we've moved backwards. Like those standards just slip so much where everyone's just taking way too big of a slice of a cake. And it's like, as an investor, you don't want to have that type of one man risk.
Well,
Yeah.
the other thing is that's weird is like basically people look at market cap and they don't care at all about overhang. It's like if you have a huge overhang and that's a high market cap, it's like, oh, it's great, it's validated by the market.
Yeah.
So it's like people discount overhang like enormously, which is a little weird to me.
Yeah.
But just back on the Tezos Foundation. So okay, so the Tezos Foundation has all these tokens. In Tezos, you're severely penalized for not delegating your tokens because you get diluted away. And so the Tezos Foundation has to either delegate those tokens, it just has to take a loss, delegate those tokens to another baker, or run its own bakers.
Mhm.
I'd rather it run its own baker because at least it gives it like some knowledge of what it is to
Yeah. Makes sense.
what it is to bake. Just a little bit of dog fooding.
Hmm.
And the thing is like say, oh well, it gives it too much powers. But fundamentally, if you were to delegate its tokens to other bakers, it would still have the same power because if he wanted to do a governance decision or
Yeah.
anything like that,
Yeah.
it could always redelegate them to themselves. It would always have this option. So I think it would be very easy to have a bit of illusion where you just take the treasury and just like go and say like, okay, you get this, you get that,
Yeah.
and
No, no, that,
it would be
that doesn't make things any better, obviously.
it would be tough for the foundation to basically delegate to a bunch of other bakers because fundamentally you can't just delegate to everyone equally because you don't know them, and so the foundation being like a regulated entity, it can't just go and delegate to unknown bakers. So we would have to like it would probably have to KYC the bakers it delegates to, which means it favors like certain probably like larger bakers over smaller bakers, and then there's a political issue of like why do you go with that baker as opposed to that baker,
Yeah.
and you'd never have neutrality. So the only way to do this in a somewhat neutral fashion for the foundation is to basically run its own bakers.
Yeah. Yeah. You either
Uh,
run your own baker or you don't stake at all and then take
yeah,
loss. But
or you take a loss,
yeah, I think,
or you sell the tails
yeah.
that you hold.
So I'm on board with you on this one. I think it makes sense. There was a pre-mine. Part of that is being staked by the foundation. That's
Um,
why it's 13% or whatever
yeah,
amount.
this could change with adaptive issuance, by the way, because if in
Mhm.
adaptive issuance we end up with like staking rate around 0.5%,
Mm.
then at that point the penalty for like not being involved in baking becomes much lower.
Yeah.
And then the foundation could say like at this point like, all right, you know what, actually we don't actually need to
Yeah.
do that, which isn't if it's more than that, it might still be worth doing it. And there's also still the value, I would say, of like, but maybe you don't do it with like the entire stake, for example. That I would that the loss of not doing it becomes like much more reasonable. Whereas it's like large, like you don't want to be like leaving on the table 6% of all the TES that the foundation
No, no, I
can
agree.
get
And,
rid
and
of.
I actually think it's I mean, like, when Satoshi launched Bitcoin, he was the majority miner for a long time until it was overtaken, and
Yeah,
miss you again on that one. It's cool. No, I think that's a perfectly satisfactory answer. I'm actually on your side on this one. Now we have another question here, which I think we've sort of covered, but it's quite long. This is by Mira Hurley, who I know is part of the Nano community.
yeah,
And she is, I need to summarize because it's far too long to read out loud. So she's concerned about centralization over time due to depots with no effect, with no lockup period. and that there'll be a concentration into larger delegates. So because smaller delegates would have a lower ROI compared to the larger ones. So that's her concern about.
Hmm.
I might be misquoting her because I'm trying
Yeah.
to summarize it here.
I mean,
Yeah,
so
let me just
Arthur,
as fun.
yeah,
What is effectively the minimum amount it's worth to run your own node and have others delegate to you? Okay,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
So economic efficiency favors centralization. So and innovation favors decentralization. So basically, the things that cause decentralization in the economy is like in disruptive innovation, and the thing that cause centralization is efficiency. So it's always it's always a race against like centralization when you design systems like this. The in a proof of stake system, your best bet against centralization is like bond ownership, because essentially like people don't want to have too much of a concentrated position inside a volatile asset. So that helps, and like forcing the bakers to own their bond on Tezos is quite, I think is helpful in this respect. And
Bless you.
I've had a bit of a cold,
Yeah, you're a champ for coming
but
on here. You're obviously a little bit sick.
in practice, in practice we've seen in practice we've seen like fairly good decentralization of bakers, so it hasn't hit up too much. There's always sneaky things. So because once you can have delegation and lending, like you could have a Lido situation where it's like, oh, everyone benefits. It's just it's like there's one staking token, staked ETH token, which is the most liquid, and everyone's going to use that. So you kind of have to fight these things, and the way you fight centralization, I think, is friction. You want to add friction into your mechanisms. And early on, I was talking to people about staking derivatives, and they would say, "Oh, staking derivatives are great; it's so efficient." And I'm like, "But you don't want efficiency. You want staking to be boring and slightly inefficient, because efficiency is going to breed centralization, which we see with those liquid staking tokens." So, anyways, it's not DPoS. So I don't know if this is like predicated on the ideas that it's DPoS
I think it is predicated on the
than
idea.
Larimer. Yeah, but it's not that, and in practice, it's held up fairly well.
Yeah.
By and large, though, like I spend more time thinking about how to make sure that the system is safe, even if it becomes centralized, rather than like how to keep it decentralized, because
Mm,
I have much more hope in the former than the latter. And the
yeah.
nice thing with proof of stake and large amount staked is you can say like, well, if all of the like first of all, don't give too much power to your bakers. Order transaction, nothing more. Polkadot makes a trade-off of like giving a little too much power, I think, to validators, and that's the thing as the Ethereum system gets well is like don't overload validators. Like let it be that the only thing they can do is basically like create two blocks at the same height, and then you deal with it with like massive slashing, and that I think is a stronger protection than trying to rely on decentralized. So you want to be decentralized, but by and large focus on security and focus on minimizing the damage that can happen from centralization.
Yeah.
It's more fruitful.
No, I agree, and I would also add. I mean, it's a common criticism of proof of stake as well. This centralization thing, but I don't know. I think a layer one blockchain. I think at least in the future, the way people will look at it is as a low risk, low return investment. Right? If you're staking on a blockchain, it's eventually in the kind of ideal future. I think that's how it would be seen, and I don't think that's where wealth concentration actually happens. It happens on the
No.
periphery. It happens with startups. It happens with entrepreneurship. It doesn't
Yeah.
happen with such a simple thing. You don't you don't like take over the world by being a staker. It's
The
it's
question makes a good point, which is like if you're a smaller baker, you
mm,
have fixed cost,
that's right.
right?
That's right. No,
So
that is fair. Yeah,
your return may be proportional to your stake, but your fixed cost are your fixed cost.
that's right. Yeah,
And the answer here is like let's try to make the fixed cost as low as possible. Like
yeah.
right now, you can run Tezos with a Raspberry Pi and a Ledger.
Hmm.
I,
Really, a
yeah,
Raspberry Pi, like, and you still achieve 1,000 TPS with that in
yeah,
terms of the layer one.
yeah.
Really?
Raspberry Pis are not bad.
Well, yeah, modern Raspberry Pis are pretty impressive, aren't they?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
still, that's awfully impressive. What is it? Because I think yeah, what is it that helps you achieve that? Because it seems like 1,000 to 3,000 TPS is the upper bound that I've seen for like a single sharded chain,
Mm.
let's say, or not
Yeah.
including things like enshrined rollups.
Mm.
Like, what is it? Like, what are the technologies that allow for that makes it so
So
efficient?
I'll preface by saying that this 1,000 number, it's basically a number we have from like, we run a bunch of benchmarks. When I say it's like nomadic labs run a bunch of benchmark on
Mhm.
gas. We run it in different machines. We try to get estimates of like how much it costs to do
What
things.
kind of geographical dispersion are we talking about here for these tests? Just so I get
So
a
these tests are
gauge.
just like on one machine. This is more about like, can this CPU handle this?
Oh, okay, okay. But
We
that
know,
means that the true TPS figure would be significantly lower then, right?
no, we know we can propagate full blocks. And the question is, then it's more about like, what does the IO look like? What is you're
Yeah,
actually like, for doing 1,000 TPS, you're not actually like bandwidth bound. You're actually compute bound.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And these would be basic transactions, obviously, right? Just
Yeah.
simple.
And so I'll preface by saying like we estimated this way, but we haven't had like a real
Mm,
life network test where somehow like 1,000
okay.
transactions are pushed on the mainnet and so on and so forth.
Yeah, okay.
So I can't guarantee what would happen, but let's say it's like it's less than 1,000 over 200.
It's good that you qualified that actually. It's good that you
Yeah,
qualified that. This is important information because I mean TPS numbers in this industry can be pretty sketchy, and I think it's important to understand the methodology behind the
yeah,
measurement. So
yeah. There's as many methodologies as there is, but it's high.
yeah,
Fees are
yeah,
fees are keeping cheap, and the way we do it is 14 protocol upgrades. So there's been a lot, especially like in 2021. A lot of the work was focused on like optimizing the L1. So it means like caching, for example. It
yeah,
means
yeah,
a bit faster IO using
yeah.
parallel. Like
I'm still very curious what the actual L1 capacity is, though. I am very curious still. But
well, we could.
you're right. 200 to 1,000 would be a fair estimate, but it's a very wide
Yeah,
range. I
yeah,
understand. You can't really know until you've really done some more thorough, geographically spread testing. You know.
yeah.
Um, yeah, that's very very interesting though. So yeah, I'm very curious to see how it evolves. I really I really hope it I suppose as the Tezos Foundation or as the founder, you really need to kind of push a little bit in terms of because with sharding, right? Like with sharding, it all just is, it's all layer one scaling, and if usage comes, then you automatically get put in a shard, etc. It seems
Yeah.
like with the enshrined rollup approach, maybe that takes a little bit more of a push for the community, for the developers to kind of understand what this is and
Mm,
how they should be building. I
yeah.
mean, because I mean, like, what happens? Yeah, what happens when the L1 becomes congested then? Because that would negatively. Oh, I suppose you're also building out data availability, right?
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
solve that problem, right? I already
Yeah.
answered my own question. It seems that that happens sometimes. All right, let's see what other questions we have here. This is a bit of a. We already talked about adaptive issuance, so that's good. Um, Yeah. So I've asked about how to bring in users. I think we've talked about in DeFi, right? How we
Mhm.
wanted to talk about that. That was a really interesting question.
Oh, how to bring users?
How to bring in more users. But I think we already talked about. Well, actually, did we? I think I asked the question, but I don't feel like you quite answered the question. Actually, now
No,
that I
no, I
think
don't.
about it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So I definitely don't answer. I don't remember the question, but
Yeah.
it's tough. So the median user. So here's the thing. Tezos has about today 50,000 monthly active users. The median blockchain has 0. So we're infinitely better than the median blockchain.
Is that per day or
No, per month,
per
monthly
month?
active,
Per month. Yeah.
monthly active.
Okay. And
So I think
that's
I think
measuring
they'll
active addresses then, or
yeah, yeah, active addresses.
yeah. Okay.
So it's possible that some users have multiple addresses. There's not a big incentives to do that.
Sure. I mean, those are comparatively, and I have a pretty good gauge of the usage numbers. It's part of what I do. That's low compared to some of your competitors. Like so,
Oh, definitely. So I
it's on
think
the low side.
Solana, Polygon, Ethereum are around 5 million.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, I think a lot of our use cases have been in like art, NFTs, and collecting, and so it begets a lot less activities than say DeFi because a DeFi trader might go and trade every day,
yeah.
whereas like collecting happens less frequently. So it's definitely lower than like the large incumbents. But again, the median blockchain has 0 user, and we actually have some. So it's much better than again a lot of protocols, but it's not good enough that you can say, oh look, we have all these users. So
Right,
it's
right.
it's super important to get more.
It's significantly lower than, say, Avalanche and Solana, for example, which are two
Yeah.
of the more prominent, and Polygon, as you mentioned as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think a lot of that is DeFi driven on those
yeah,
on those chains.
it is. Yeah.
So yeah, a big priority is to get more users. I think it's one of them like throughout like there's foundation funds like several organizations who are like really basically like essentially focused on Tezos, like Nomadic Labs, Tech in London, and TZ APAC. And throughout all those organizations, like one of the thing I've tried to suggest and instill is like focus on like monthly active addresses, weekly active addresses as like a thing to target, because it's tractable. It's like in some sense, it's better than say, oh, our target should be to make Tezos number one. Well, yeah, that's a great target, but like it's not clear how to achieve that.
Yeah.
Whereas on a day-to-day basis, saying like, okay, how do we get 10% more users? How do we get like 1,000 more
Yeah.
monthly active is a little more tractable.
Yeah, a
So it's been
focus
a
on usage is much healthier than a focus on market cap. I'll agree with you on that.
I mean, the thing is, like, market cap is super useful and important.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's not actionable.
Yeah, exactly. It's very much out of your hands, that one. Until you reach a I don't know, a threshold of usage, right? Because then the market cap comes. Yeah.
Maybe there's not like it's not like a direct economic or like mathematical relationship, but like usage is something you can do something about. Like you can actually like try something, see if it worked, and then react on that. You want to be in a you want to be in a feedback loop where you can actually like see if what you're doing is working. So yeah, adoption is super important. We've taken different paths. The areas of focus for this organization have been around primarily DeFi, arts and culture, and
So what was that last?
yeah, so DeFi, arts and culture, and
So what's that last thing you mentioned with culture?
art and culture.
Art and culture. I
So
see.
mostly collectibles.
Interesting.
We have a little bit in sports, and
Okay.
and also but a big one is also gaming.
Okay. Yeah. Out of all those, I'm the most bullish in DeFi.
It
I'm a bit skeptical of some of the GameFi and a lot of the NFT and GameFi
yeah.
stuff. I'm very skeptical of.
So
Yeah.
DeFi has the most proven product market fit
Yeah. Correct.
by far.
Yeah.
It has like the most proven revenues in this space.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense to me, right? Like good decentralized money needs good decentralized finance, right? Makes
But
sense.
you need to be financing something if it's and once you have like a good lending protocol and once you have a good trading platform, what are you inventing?
Now, what's next,
on
right?
on, on top of that. And I mean, initially, like in 2021, basically my impression was that a lot of the DeFi was going to be won by Binance Smart Chain, because a lot of the DeFi traders who basically wanted to trade. They didn't care that much about like fundamentally like, is this a store of value? What is the length of this chain? If your horizon is like a couple days, then you don't care so much about decentralization. Uh, so they had this. They had Ethereum compatibility. They had a massive distribution channel through their users. They had native bridging because they could bridge all assets custodied at Binance onto BSC.
Mm-hmm.
And at the point, it was like, I don't see. I was very surprised to see that Polygon and Avalanche managed to get some DeFi activity, and it didn't just all go to BSC. BSC must have done something wrong to do this happen, and so I didn't see like specifically with the scaling that was on Tezos. I didn't see Tezos as like particularly in a good position at the beginning of 2021 to compete in the
Mm-hmm.
DeFi space.
Yeah.
I think with like scaling and having a lot more throughput, we could have some unique selling point for DeFi now,
Yeah.
with some of the core protocol
Yeah.
advancements.
Now with enshrined rollups, I think really, and I think that's where any like chain now that's offering, if all the other fundamentals are sound, or most of them at least, then as long as you can scale, then now is really a golden opportunity to really make a difference and rise in prominence. And
Yeah.
I really am hoping that for Tezos as well.
The downside of DeFi, so we've mentioned all the upside. I would say the downside is I think it's the one that's it's the one that's least it's the one that's the most at risk of being targeted by regulators, like attacked by regulators, whereas I think the other ones are a lot harder to attack. Art and culture gaming, for example.
No, true, and anything finance is going to
So
be more touchy as well for
yeah,
regulators.
it's
Understandably.
a lot more defensive in this respect, and also DeFi brings more revenue, brings more activity, but it's a much smaller community. Whereas with gaming, the dream is that a mediocre game has more users than a successful blockchain,
Yeah, yeah, no,
and that's
it's
still like
true.
it's not been cracked, but it's still very appealing to all of a sudden saying like, boom, you get your 5 million monthly active in one go.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not I don't know, I'm not convinced on the GameFi thing, at least from the gaming perspective. But
Mm.
I won't. I won't go too much into that here. I think that's unnecessary. It's just, yeah. I just don't see how it creates a better game, or how you solve the problem of like game companies cooperating. Like, I just don't see it solving these problems. And yeah, and it's also like it's maybe running into some of the security token arguments as well, to a certain extent, because I also see it like, well, in the case of a game, there's a central issuer anyway, right? So it's
Mhm.
kind of like the enforcement problem again, and again, similar story to what I see with security tokens and
Yeah,
such. But yeah, I want to be wrong. There's a lot of things I want to be wrong about when it comes to cryptocurrency and blockchain. But
yeah,
yeah, I'm really do believe in having some intellectual honesty here when it comes to these narratives, and that's something I've been put here to do as well, and ask some hard questions. I'm looking for more questions here on the tweet that I did, and I think we've actually covered it all. People are here telling me, make sure I don't take it easy on you. I know
uh,
I'm scared I'm taking it too easy on you. Maybe I
but
need
you were
to.
you were very nice. You want to ask me like
Ooh, I have one.
ask me a
I've
mean question.
a harder
Okay.
question. I've a harder question. The burn rate for the
Yeah,
foundation,
yeah,
it's very high. It's a
it's too high.
very, very high burn rate,
Yeah,
and yet there's not a lot of adoption to show
yeah,
for it.
yeah. No, I know. Like so this topic is like what should happen to the burn rate is number one, is like, and what is a normal result of the burn rate is number two.
Yeah.
So I looking, the foundation kept a lot of its treasury in Bitcoin, and part of the reason was that once you cover like a basis of liquidity in like something that's more stable, that guarantees that you keep the lights on and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
There was an advantage in being correlated to the overall market, which is that in boom times you can spend more.
Yeah.
Uh, and if what is primarily relevant is your like relation to other protocol as opposed to like what you're doing in the absolutes, then it's good to actually be correlated to the market. So as a result, the foundation get a lot in Bitcoin. And in 2021, we're in a situation where Tezos had been quite relevant in 2020 with staking and Coinbase launching, staking on Tezos. But the whole narrative was around staking and baking, which I thought was quite bad. A lot of people were saying, "Oh, what's great is you get rewards from staking," and like, no, that's not great. That should be boring. It cannot be about that.
Yeah.
And that was a dangerous
I'm
narrative.
glad you said that. Yeah.
And as soon as DeFi summer came, people were saying like, "Oh wait, if you thought yield was great, here's another form of yield." And Tezos didn't have the tooling ready. Tezos didn't have the dApps. Tezos wasn't like there for DeFi when it mattered.
Yeah.
So then enter 2021. It's a bull market. We have a protocol that's like has great proof of stake, but doesn't have a lot of scaling. Doesn't have a lot of advantages compared to other protocols. You have Cosmos out there with 3-second blocks. Tezos has like 1 minute or 30-second blocks at the time. We don't have finality on the consensus. So it was very, very good. It was the best protocol in 2018, but it was definitely not the best protocol in 2021. So it didn't find itself to be particularly competitive. And it was better than Ethereum, but Ethereum had the benefit of like scale and a network effect. But the foundation has all this money at the time, and so the spending increased considerably in that period to try to keep up. It's just like, let's try everything. Um, and now that the foundation treasury has shrunk, now that it's like leaner times, of course it makes sense to reduce the burn. And like that's been going on since 2022. There's been a lot of exercises in cost rationalization. And whereas in the past it was more like, can this help? Can this help quickly? Can this do something? Then let's do it. Now it's more of like, okay, what is this going to do? How do we measure the outcome of this? Like, what is the cost of user acquisition that comes with this thing? So it's a lot more numbers driven and rationalized, rather than saying like, if this is positive for the ecosystem, let's do it. Because at the time, the risk was basically for Tezos losing relevance was the foundation would keep a very large treasury, which didn't make sense. Unfortunately, a lot of the spending didn't work. A typical example of this is like starting in, let's look at March of 2021. March in 2021, again, we're in a situation, there's basically no marketing operation. There was clearly a lack of marketing in the Tezos ecosystem, but there was also no marketing team. There was one that had tried to launch a new website for like 8 months. It was like, who couldn't get an infographic together. So we started working with a new marketing team, but they're very new. And at the time, they suggest doing, they suggest doing like a sports sponsorship because it brings a use case to Tezos. Because at the time, also, I look at this and there was very few sports NFTs. It was just basically Top Shots and Sorare who were printing money, and it's like, wow, it's a large amount of money in the absolute, but it's a very small fraction of the Tezos Foundation budget, and it's something that can be done tomorrow. Like tomorrow, this can start doing marketing as opposed to like building a team for 6 months and doing something in 6 months. And there was urgency. So at the time, not an unreasonable decision. Looking forward, obviously, ROI in terms of like brand visibility and so on and so forth wasn't there. It wasn't, like if I had to do it again, as opposed to spending the money on that, do the Polygon strategy of like hiring 100 BD people and just saying like, pay them in commission, go and get as many projects as possible, better.
Yeah.
Or the Solana strategy of like running big hacker houses and all of that. But
Yeah.
that one, that one didn't pan out. Obviously, we learned from that. We're not doing that anymore. But a lot of the budget have gone down. A lot of reduction and rationalization of the cost. So we're trying to do more and also like be a lot more focused with less. Now, as to the question of like why spending so much, what is spending the equivalent of the cost of the lunar mission? In India's mission to the moon cost $90 million.
Oh no, really? That is.
Yeah,
Oh wow,
that
that's
is
mind-blowing.
cheap. So that is a very cheap lunar mission.
Is that inflation adjusted? No,
Yeah, no, it
oh,
just
no.
happened like last year.
Oh, a modern lunar mission. Okay, got it. Yeah, not
Yeah.
the Saturn V. Obviously, that would be a lot more.
No, the one where
Yeah.
they put like something on the pole.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, no, but that is fair. I mean, like the Tezos ICO was one of the biggest. Like, okay, the timing was bad on a few of the other parts, but at least your
Yeah.
timing of the ICO was good. So that's at least a saving grace that you still have a large treasury in the foundation here to work with.
The thing with inefficiency is like also the prices got bid up insanely in 2021. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I was very focused on was middleware. So I was thinking, look, if you want developers to build on Tezos, they need to have access to the middleware. So let's say, for example, that they need access to like this particular integration provider that provides this one service on chain. And you go talk to them, and normally, you're talking about something that would cost like $20,000 in engineering costs for them to integrate Tezos. And they go in and say like $10 million, $20 million. And, it's like, why is that? Because they can. And it's just like the revenue model is basically not to try to make revenue from customers, but was to extract very large amount of money from like foundation treasuries.
And
now, I don't think we did that like particularly like many of those deals, but like trying to get anything done is like simple integration, $250,000, and like even to this day in these markets, there are firms that will charge you $250,000 for changing a line in a config file.
Yeah, I imagine because I mean it grew so fast, right? That ICO was just massive and it was unprecedented at the time. I think the next one that got as high was like EOS or something, right?
No, it was Filecoin. Filecoin was just like a few weeks later.
Oh yeah, so Falcon
went
was
more.
like the biggest, right? And I think Tezos is probably like the third biggest ICO ever after
Well,
Filecoin and EOS, if I remember
the
correctly.
Tezos Foundation fundraiser raised $232 million at the time.
Okay.
Filecoin raised about 250. And
Yeah.
then EOS, it depends like how many people cost, like when do you count it? But
I'm also
some people
skeptical.
count it as
Like,
a few billions.
I think they might have put in their own money and then pretended like it was a lot
yeah,
bigger than it was.
they talked about that. But
That probably happened.
Definitely Block One seems to have a bunch of money.
Yeah, well, they definitely do. As they ran away with it and abandoned their community. That's That was crazy what happened there.
But they have a legal incentive to. Basically, they have a settlement with the SEC, and in some sense, they're like, well, in some sense, like the laws are very perverse. They're saying like,
Yeah, yeah,
don't like spend this money on yacht if you want, but
yeah.
let us not catch you use that money to improve the network.
Yeah, yeah. It was. I mean, like EOS is like the perfect example of the foundation gone wrong. Like that's definitely not the case to that extreme with Tezos.
It's a private company.
There's a middle
It's block
ground there.
one. It's like
Yeah,
the Tezos Foundation was set up specifically with like a governance. It's like a Swiss foundation. It's a non-profit. It has a
yeah,
purpose. It has to be Tezos. So
yeah.
there's a lot of protection that are in place, and that's the thing that Ethereum did right, I think, and
It is.
it was copied from that.
Yeah, that is one of the things that Ethereum got right. I imagine though, like things growing that quickly, it must have been. I mean, like I definitely had some overwhelming times where my company grew quickly, and
Yeah.
I mean, the scale of what you were involved with was even greater. I imagine it must have maybe run away from you a bit at times. I can imagine. I certainly have had that experience. When you grow very quickly and then
Yeah.
things are a little bit out of control, and then it takes a while to kind of bring things back and to
Mm.
change management and get the right people and drama with teams. And it's just,
Yeah.
there's a lot more that happens than I think people see on the surface with these type of
Mm.
large organizations.
Well, the current thinking around the Tezos Foundation is to try to maintain a 7 to 10 year runway, essentially, because it gives you time to think and
Yeah.
try experiments, and then it gives you dry powder if and when you find something that really works and you want to apply into. And so, like having the time to iterate. In 2021, it felt very different. It felt like this was a race,
Yeah.
and if you don't win that race, essentially, like you're going to be stuck
Yeah.
in a bad position. And to some extent, like Tezos is not win
Yeah.
that race in terms of like
Yeah.
relevance and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we dropped a lot after 2020. I think a lot of it is a function of basically the ecosystem stagnating a lot between 2018 and 2020. It was kind of like once a new like wave of blockchain came in, and with low latency and a lot of applications, it became fantastically hard. But it was basically this like kind of like Silicon Valley type, grow as much as possible, as quickly as possible to
Yeah.
grab thing. We're in a very different position now, and so I think it radically changes the strategy, which is like a lot more like numbers driven, metric driven,
Yeah.
and more frugal and focused.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you're in a position now, now the timing seems right. You're able to offer something that most other incumbents, or at least the dominant incumbents, can't offer. And I think that's really important
I
that you're
think
able
that's a
to do that.
misconception in the Tezos. In some sense. Sometimes I think the Tezos ecosystem is a victim uh, of its own love for the blockchain, because they're saying like, oh, Tezos is so fantastic. Clearly the only problem that we have is because there's no marketing, or the only problem we have is
Hmm.
because there's no this or that. And yes, there's a part of like irrational experiences in the market, but to some extent, there is something about having like technical USPs that is still quite important. If you look at the successful blockchain, they did have very strong technical
Correct.
USPs.
That's correct. Yeah.
Perhaps with the exception of Polygon, which had really crap technology,
Mm,
but superb positioning and BD. And also they showered everyone with like tons of money. Like
yeah.
for all the money that this foundation spent, like it's dwarfed by the amount that Polygon spent to buy projects.
Yeah. And I'm curious because Tezos never really did they didn't do subsidized DeFi, because I think a lot of other projects, what they did is they say, oh, we're going to take a huge amount of money and we're going to pump this into DeFi to bring up the APY numbers, right? And
Yeah,
that brings an influx of users, and then the subsidization run out, and most of the time they leave.
but
That's
the only
something
people.
Tezos never did, was it? That
Well, Tezos Foundation never did that.
Yeah.
There's a pool of liquidity between wrapped Bitcoin and Tez that exists that's subsidized on chain,
Okay.
called liquidity baking. But the foundation never did subsidize, aside from like building libraries, investing
Yeah.
in DeFi companies, giving grant to DeFi builders, but like never like just like, oh, we'll pay you for
Yeah. Yeah.
for
Because
participating in DeFi. It's not worked for anyone. Like it's worked. Sorry, it's worked for Polygon. Polygon is the only people who pulled it off. Every
I think
other.
AVAX pulled it off as well, because I think they pumped a lot into certain DeFi things
Yeah, but
just to
look,
pump up
but
APYs.
look at the TVL number. It
Yeah,
didn't stay.
it's dropped off a cliff when it stopped, but
The,
it's
the other one who has like managed
yeah.
to like get any stickiness out of it has been Polygon.
Yeah, that might be true actually. Yeah, yeah, because it
Uh,
works for a while, and then I'm not sure like what the usage would be on Avalanche if they didn't do that, because it's still relatively
yeah.
high. It's still in like the top 10.
Avalanche
Um,
did have the benefit of like really low latency, which I think was like
yeah,
an important feature for DeFi trader. Plus the EVM compatibility, which like essentially let a bunch of products just copy paste
yeah,
into Avalanche.
yeah, because
But anyways,
that's one of the things Tezos was lacking as well, was the EVM compatibility. Well, lacking.
yeah,
That's, I think, at least was a hindrance for quicker developments in
yeah,
Tezos for sure.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's something that's coming. I
Um,
understand as well, or
so one of the first roll-up, so the core teams when they were building the roll-up engine, it's important to
ah,
like dogfood it. So we built an
yeah.
Ethereum roll-up called Etherlink. That's launching
Oh,
in a bit.
cool,
So
cool.
essentially, like
Is that an
I think it would be
Enshrined
a good
rollup,
fit for the.
or one of the other ones?
Well, it's running with the Enshrined engine.
Okay.
So in this respect, yes. The question is like, if there's a bug in Etherlink with the whole chain fork in order to protect Etherlink, uh, that's that's TBD. I think it's
That's a tricky one. Yeah, that's a
yeah.
tricky dilemma.
I,
Like
I I would want to say yes. I would want to say like yes. This rollup is special. It's not
yeah,
just any random rollup. It's like one that's like
yeah,
tied to the chain.
yeah, yeah,
But I think we'll have to get some community feeling around that. I don't know how to do it because it's more of a social thing. So if it's
yeah,
just like if it's a vote to just like
yeah,
flip a bit and say like yes we commit
yeah.
to
I mean, having EVM compatibility helps, but I don't think it's the end and be all of everything. I mean, just look at Solana. It had success in drawing usage, and it's not EVM compatible.
yeah
So I
yeah. But I
mean,
think they had
yeah,
it in spite of this and because they
yeah,
also
that's fair.
invested so much
Yeah,
in like developer hacker houses and all of that.
yeah, that's fair.
Plus VCs. The thing is if you have 90% of your treasury which is held by VCs, essentially you have kind of like this ecosystem play where the VCs are going to invest in a lot of these companies to create
Mm,
tokens because they have this exposure
yeah,
to the underlying token, which is a dynamic that has lacked in the Tezos ecosystem.
yeah,
But that,
because
that's a function of like how the launch was set up.
that could be. I mean, might that not? Oh, I suppose you can't use the foundation money to say do a VC fund. Then could you? That would be. Would that go against the rules of the foundation, or
To do what to fund? I mean,
to create a VC fund to stimulate DeFi?
no. I mean, in fact, it was one of we were the first to propose like this, but the foundation has invested in DeFi projects
Oh, okay, it has.
on
Okay, okay,
Tezos.
cool. So that is
Yeah, of
possible.
course.
Yeah, because that's a pretty decent way to stimulate
Yeah,
usage. You know, it's a bit of a dice roll because
but you
it's
also want it to
shotgun.
be sustainable. Like
Yeah,
you don't just want to be like
yeah,
paying for the project to exist and then it doesn't have like a prospect. But like very few DeFi protocols have been able to like actually be sustainable.
yeah. No, that's
Um,
true. That's absolutely true, and it's yeah, it's been quite the journey for Tezos for all these years, haven't it? Hasn't it? How do you feel?
yeah,
It's how do you feel like? Because I mean, this is your life now. I can relate to that. I mean, crypto is also my life. How
yeah.
do you feel it's changed you? This whole experience of founding a blockchain, riding
It's
it out for all these years. How do you?
it's given me a lot of gray hair.
Yeah, I think I have a few gray hairs as well.
It's
I look younger than I am
on a
actually.
personal look. It's a fantastic experience. It's a wild experience and gives you wild story to tell. But like in terms of like peacefulness in life, founding an L1 is a horrible idea, and I wouldn't wish it on like my worst enemy. Uh you know,
Yeah,
if I instead I had created a nice, like market maker because my background is as a market maker, nice market maker for cryptocurrency, I would have made way more money and would have had like
more chill, huh?
100x less problems in my life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Understand.
It sucks, but it is what it is, and I put a lot of pride in Tezos, and it's very important for me for it to be successful.
And that's what makes it worthwhile, right? Because that gives it meaning, and that gives our lives more meaning. To be
Uh,
building something that matters, right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That's how I feel as well. Turns out, hedge fund manager wasn't the easiest path for me to take either, or Bitcoin and nowadays Ethereum critic also wasn't the easiest path for me to take, especially
yeah,
considering the other hats that I wear.
yeah.
But I think it's sometimes the road least travel is the most worth taking. And I think you have that in spades. I mean, it's how you've been able to be a pioneer, not once but many times in blockchain innovation. And I just think that's really exciting. And I think Tezos is really exciting for that reason. And I can see how it's really well positioned to make an impact. It's all about what features do you have at what time to kind of
Yeah,
to to
yeah.
to gain
The
that
thing
dominance.
I was saying is like sometimes I would say this community looks at like, oh, why are we doing all this core development? We already have the best technology. What we need is more adoption and so on and so forth. And like we have great technology, but it's really an uphill battle to get adoption unless you are like much stronger, unless you
Yeah,
have like a very strong USP compared to the
yeah,
competition.
yeah,
And I feel like we can get that with scaling, but like we have to get the chain very good. Like just with the existing L1,
yeah.
we don't have enough of a USP to basically like be very attractive
Hmm.
compared to incumbents. Like
No, I
yes,
agree.
there's advantages, but like your advantages need to be much stronger than that
Yeah,
to really drive people.
yeah, and that's where the L1 scaling through enshrined rollups comes in. I think that's the unique USB to me. I think governance is, if I'm being honest, I don't think it's something most people care about, but it's going to make or break your chain in either 5 or 10 or
Mm.
20 years from now. And I think it's great that you have that in mind.
Yeah,
It really strikes me as you're a person, and what you mentioned before, like I see this so much in cryptocurrency communities. People are like, oh, we have the best chain and nothing else even comes close, and we have all the best technology and nothing can even compete, and how come everyone doesn't see this? And I've literally heard this same speech like 50 times in 50 different cryptocurrencies.
yeah.
Oh,
No, of
probably
course.
more than 100, honestly. I hear this thing like, "Oh, we're obviously the best, and how come no one else sees us?" And you got one little silo, you got another little silo that's basically saying the same thing, and it's like it's so. And I can see how you haven't fallen
Yeah,
for that trap, and you're just gonna keep pushing for innovation, because
yeah.
if you
I
thought you're the best, you're not gonna innovate.
I do think we're underhyped. So like
I
I
agree.
think it's not enough. I think we need to be better technologically.
Yeah.
But in my heart of hearts, I do think that the amount of attention that we get compared to like what we actually achieve
Yeah.
is very weird and very and very often. And I realize it's a common refrain, but like I have external validation in some sense. You know, I know a lot of technical like founders of L1, technical founders. Like
Mhm.
we have a lot of respect from a
Mhm.
technological perspective from like external parties.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, And so, given that, the fact that it's just like so little talked about, I think there's
Yeah.
a perception and awareness problem that's real.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll add to that as well. I do feel that way. I do think Tezos is one of those underappreciated chains, and maybe I mean there's so many different factors to think about. And I think you've done a really good
Yeah.
job describing the different factors why that's the case. But it
Mm.
could also somewhat also be because well, you didn't launch before Ethereum did, so you weren't the first. But you're also not like this new shiny thing either, right? Tezos has been around for a long time, so
That's exactly the problem. It's not a shiny new entrant,
yeah,
and it's not a solid incumbent. And so people say
yeah,
like, well, if Tezos was going to win, why hasn't it won before?
yeah. It's a
And
difficult
that's one
middle
of
ground to be in, and
it's very tough. And I think
yeah,
the only way to claw our way out of this is basically like through like adoption. Just
yeah,
basically like once you get as much adoption as Ethereum, you force people to kind of pay
yeah,
attention.
yeah.
But
Oh,
it's tough to get there. The other thing I think is like, and it was never like I don't think it was my doing or anyone's doing, but initially a lot of the Tezos was positioned as a Ethereum hedge, and sometimes like oh who knows things might go wrong with Ethereum. Here's
mm,
another network.
mm,
But a lot of our design decisions are similar to Ethereum in terms of like choices for decentralization. Like
yeah,
there's a lot more DNA in common, I would say, with Ethereum than with a lot of other projects. Uh, and so when Ethereum was kind of weak, which is in 2020, I think Tezos was perceived as being very solid. And with Ethereum becoming more and more popular, and so people would say like, oh well, we thought Tezos would be important if Ethereum failed, but clearly things are going well in Ethereum land. Ergo, Tezos is not that interesting.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that's also like part of the dynamic.
And I think I mean I've always been interested in Tezos, always maintained a position in that as well. But I think I was guilty of that as well, and I think it's only really when it really became clear that Ethereum was not scaling. Like that to me changed things for me in a big way. It's like, okay, Ethereum has pivoted away from L1 scaling. And what that
Yeah.
means to me is that some of the alternatives, like Tezos, now actually have a much stronger unique selling point.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it would have just been like, well, it's just another Ethereum kind of, and I care a lot about governance, but again, I don't think other people care as much about governance as I do. So that's where the scalability is that real practical user advantage, for people. And I think that's where Tezos can be seen in a new light and, can have um, a new day in the sun, so to speak. And that's something I'm looking for. That's part of why I was so excited having you on this show as well, just to kind of highlight that. And hopefully this show generates lots of views. We'll see how we go, but it's
And generate lots of views for Tezos and for your show, and we all win.
Exactly.
Very good.
And I think that's actually a good way to kind of round things down. And this is
we've been in it for what, like 4 hours now?
3.5 hours, which
3.5
is
hours,
very good. And I feel like there isn't a lot of long form content in crypto podcasting nowadays. So I feel like that's an area, long form, deep, really get down in the weeds, kind of Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman style kind of podcast is what I'm aiming for. And I'm glad you.
I'll plug Dwarkesh. It's my favorite long form podcast.
Which one? Sorry.
Dwarkesh Patel.
Okay, good plug. And I feel like that's. Go ahead.
Present company excluded.
Well, I'm not even launched yet, to be fair, so I don't blame you. I feel like that's where we can add a bit. I feel like there's an authenticity to that kind of long form. I feel like you can kind of BS your way through like a 1 hour discussion. You basically run out of lines after the second hour or so. It's part of the reason why I like this long format is it really gets to the bottom and we really get to dig deep and really get a bit of a feel for each other and the audience gets that as well. And I think that's a great thing. And I'm so happy you came on here. And it was, like I said, a real honor. And I've been following Tezos for all these years. And to meet the man behind it, behind a lot of it at least, it was a great experience. I really enjoyed this chat a lot. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye.